In December 2017, the royal family gathered at Buckingham Palace for the annual pre-Christmas lunch. It was a private occasion, the kind the palace prefers to keep private, which means the kind that generates coverage, precisely because of the preference. Meghan Markle was there. She had been engaged to Prince Harry for 3 weeks. She was, by any honest assessment of the moment, the most scrutinized woman in Britain. American, biracial, an actress, a divorcee, someone whose arrival in the royal family had already generated the specific combination of celebration and hostility that the British press reserves for people it has not yet decided what to do with. She was meeting the extended family for the first time. Seated across from her at lunch was Princess Markle of Kent. Princess Markle arrived wearing a brooch. Not any brooch, a blackamoor brooch, a piece of antique jewelry depicting a black figure in the specific decorative tradition of 18th century Europe, that is, by any contemporary understanding of what such imagery represents and where it comes from, not something you wear to lunch with the woman your nephew is about to marry. Whether Princess Markle knew what she was doing, only Princess Markle knows. What everyone else knew, by the following morning when the photographs were published and the coverage had formed its opinion, was that the brooch had been worn, and that Meghan had been in the room, and that the combination of those two facts was being read as a statement. Princess Markle's office issued an apology. The apology said the brooch had been worn without malicious intent, and that Princess Markle was sorry for any offense caused. This was, by the standards of Princess Markle's apologies across the preceding 4 decades, a relatively prompt and complete one. She had not always apologized promptly or completely. She had not always apologized at all. She was not, by temperament or by the specific character that 7 decades of living as Princess Markle of Kent had produced in her, a woman who found apology the instinctive response to the occasions that required it. She was also not, by any honest accounting, the woman the royal family had expected when Prince Michael of Kent told them in 1977 that he intended to marry Marie Christine von Reibnitz. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What they had expected is difficult to specify, because the expectation of the institution regarding the romantic choices of its members is rarely stated directly. What they received was this: a 6-foot Austrian baroness of extraordinary physical presence and equally extraordinary confidence in her own opinions, whose father had been an SS officer, whose previous marriage had ended in annulment, whose Catholicism had required Prince Michael to renounce his place in the succession, and who would spend the following 5 decades being described by the British press as Princess Pushy, and by her own assessment as more royal than the royals. Both descriptions were partially accurate. This is her story. Marie Christine Anna Agnes Hedwig Ida von Reibnitz was born on the 15th of January, 1945, in Karlsbad, which was at that moment a city in the Sudetenland, and would within months be a city in Czechoslovakia, and would within years be a city called Karlovy Vary, in a country that had been reorganized by history in the way that Central European cities are reorganized by history, completely, permanently, and without particular regard for the people who had been living there when the reorganization began. She was born into the specific chaos of the last months of the Second World War in Central Europe, which is a chaos that people who were not born into it have difficulty fully imagining. The war was ending, but it had not ended, which meant the worst of what wars produce, the displacement, the violence, the collapse of the ordinary structures that make daily life possible, was still fully operational. The Eastern Front was collapsing toward the West. The Soviet advance was producing the specific terror of a military force whose relationship to the civilian populations it was moving through was not governed by any of the conventions that military forces are supposed to observe. Her mother was Countess Maria Anna Carolina Franziska Walpurga Bernadette von Schapari. Her father was Baron Gunther Hubertus von Reibnitz. The father is the detail that would follow Marie Christine for the rest of her life, with the specific persistence of historical facts that cannot be undone and can only be managed with varying degrees of success. Gunther von Reibnitz had been a member of the Nazi Party. He had been a member of the SS. He had held the rank of Sturmbannführer, which is the SS equivalent of major, and he had held it in the specific context of a military organization whose crimes were not incidental to its function, but constitutive of it. The SS was not a military institution that committed crimes on the side. It was an institution that was criminal in its essential nature, and that attracted, or produced, or was composed of, people whose participation in its essential nature was their defining institutional contribution. What Günther von Reibnitz specifically did within the SS is a matter of incomplete historical record. The records that have been examined do not establish that he personally participated in the specific crimes that the SS organized and administered. The records do establish that he was a member of an organization that he held rank within it, and that the membership and the rank are not, in the accounting of the post-war decades, the kind of biographical facts that disappear into the general noise of a complicated history. Marie Christine did not choose her father. She was born in 1945 and was therefore 0 years old when the war ended, and her father's SS membership became a historical fact rather than a current operational reality. The choosing of a father is not available to anyone, and the argument that a person should be held accountable for their parents' decisions is an argument that fails the most basic test of individual responsibility. The argument that the press would eventually make was not quite this argument. It was the argument that a woman who wished to marry into the British royal family and who wished to occupy a position of some prominence within it had a specific obligation to engage honestly and completely with the facts of her family's history, and that the engagement Marie Christine offered was not always honest and not always complete. This argument has more merit, but the merit of the argument is the conclusion of a story that begins here, in 1945, in Carlsbad, with a woman who had not yet become Princess Michael of Kent, and who had not yet had any occasion to engage with any question about her father, because the first question is simply the fact of the birth and the world the birth happened into. The world the birth happened into was collapsing. The von Reibnitz family moved. The specific geography of the movement, which borders they crossed, at what point in 1945, in what circumstances, is not in the public record with the precision that the movement itself deserves. What is in the public record is that they ended up in Mozambique, which was Portuguese East Africa, which was the specific kind of destination that German families with complicated histories sometimes reached in the immediate post-war years, through routes that did not require engagement with the administrative machinery of the countries they passed through. Mozambique in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a Portuguese colonial territory with a small European population and the specific quality of a place that is far from Europe in every sense that matters when you are trying to be far from Europe. The von Reibnitz family, without the father, who had separated from the mother by this point, the specific dissolution of a family that the war had produced, without anyone being required to account for the production, built what life was available. Marie Christine was 3 years old when they arrived, and would spend her childhood in a colonial East Africa that was not the England she would eventually inhabit, or the Vienna she would eventually claim as her spiritual home, but that was the world available, and that she inhabited with the specific energy of someone who had not yet learned that the world available was not always the world intended. She was, by every account of people who knew her in those years, an extraordinary child. Not extraordinary in the soft, general sense that people apply to children they like. Extraordinary in the specific sense of someone whose qualities exceed what the available environment can contain, who is brighter, more energetic, more socially present, more everything than the ordinary developmental template produces. She was tall from early on, in the way that some people are simply tall from the beginning, and the height, combined with the self-possession that her mother appears to have cultivated in her, produced a child who moved through whatever space she was in with the carriage and the confidence of someone who has decided that the space is hers. Her mother was the primary formative influence. Countess Maria von Szapary was Hungarian aristocracy, the specific kind of Central European aristocracy that had been displaced by the war and its aftermath, and that maintained, in displacement, a relationship to its own significance that the displacement had not diminished. She had titles, she had the conviction, which titles sometimes produce, and which titles cannot always sustain, but which hers appears to have produced and sustained, that who she was by birth was a fact about the world rather than a claim about herself. She communicated this conviction to Marie Christine. The communication was not subtle. Marie Christine absorbed it with the completeness of a child who absorbs the primary lesson of the primary parent. Absorbed it so completely that it became not a belief she held, but a quality she was, indistinguishable from her essential character, in the way that early formation is indistinguishable from character when the formation is thorough enough and early enough. She was born to be something. The something had a specific shape: European aristocracy, the world of titles and lineage, and the specific social architecture of a class that had survived the 20th century's most sustained attempts to eliminate it, and that had survived with, if not its material circumstances entirely intact, its self-understanding entirely intact. The self-understanding was the thing. She was not wealthy. The von Reibnitz family in Mozambique was comfortable rather than wealthy, and comfortable in the specific reduced sense of people who were once more comfortable and who maintained the forms of their previous circumstances without always maintaining the substance. There was no great house, no estate, no accumulated inheritance of the kind that the aristocratic self-understanding she had absorbed was supposed to be accompanied by. There was the self-understanding itself. She carried it through Mozambique and through the education that followed. She was sent to school in Europe, to the convent school in England that her mother had determined was the appropriate institution, and the determination itself communicated something about the maternal project, which was the production of a daughter who would move through the world as someone who belonged in its better rooms. Marie Christine moved through the convent school as she moved through everything, with the full force of someone for whom the environment is a stage, and the stage is hers, and the performance is simply the expression of what she actually is, rather than a performance at all. She arrived in London in the 1960s. London in the 1960s was undergoing the specific cultural reorganization that the decade produced in most of the cities of the Western world, and London's version of it had a particular energy, the energy of a city that had been the capital of an empire and that was reorganizing itself around the knowledge that the empire was gone, that the forms of significance available in its absence were different and required a different relationship to who you were and what that entitled you to. Marie Christine found this London interesting. She found most things interesting. She had the quality of the genuinely intellectually curious, the specific form of curiosity that is not performance, not the strategic deployment of interest as a social tool, but the real thing, the genuine engagement with what the world contains that makes everything available as material. She was interested in art, in history, in the specific texture of the European past from which her family had come, and which she carried in the self-understanding her mother had given her. She was also interested in men. This is not a prurient observation. It is a biographical one. The men she was interested in, and who were interested in her, were, consistently and without apparent exception, men of significant social position. This was not calculation in the cynical sense. She was not a woman who made cold decisions about whom to pursue on the basis of what the pursuing would produce. It was selection in the deeper sense of someone who moved through the world in the expectation of the better rooms, and who found in the better rooms the people who occupied them, and who was interested in those people. She married one of them in 1971. Thomas Trowbridge was not a member of the royal family. He was a banker, he was English, he was of a suitable social background, and the marriage was conducted with the appropriate form and produced, over its brief duration, the experience of a marriage that was not what either person involved had intended, and that ended in annulment in 1977. The annulment is significant for the reasons that annulments are significant in the context of the Catholic Church, whose member Marie Christine was, and whose sacramental understanding of marriage makes an annulment a different thing from a divorce. Not the ending of a marriage, but the determination that the marriage, in the sacramental sense, never properly began. Whether the marriage to Trowbridge properly began in any of the available senses, the historical record does not specify. What the record specifies is that by 1977 it was over, the Church had determined it was annullable, and Marie Christine was free to marry again. What she was free to marry was the question. The answer arrived in the form of Prince Michael of Kent. Prince Michael George Charles Franklin was born in 1942, the son of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. He was the cousin of the Queen, a relatively distant cousin in the operational sense of the royal family, not a working royal, not someone whose constitutional significance was primary, but a prince nonetheless, with the title and the position and the specific gravitational field that titles and positions generate in the world that Marie Christine had been moving through since her mother formed her in it. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him, genuinely charming. Quiet where Marie Christine was loud, reserved where she was expansive. The specific complement to her specific qualities in the way that successful pairs sometimes complement each other, each providing what the other lacks, the combination producing something that neither could produce alone. He fell in love with her. The falling in love was not a surprise to anyone who had observed Marie Christine in operation. She was 6 feet tall. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the specific dramatic way that her particular combination of Central European features and self-possession produced. She was brilliant in conversation, and she was in possession of the quality that had been installed in her since childhood, the absolute conviction that she was someone, that being in her company was a privilege, that the room she was in was the room worth being in. Prince Michael was in her room. He wanted to stay in it. The institution, when it learned about the wanting, began to form its views. The institution's views on the matter of Prince Michael and Marie Christine von Reibnitz arrived through the specific channels that institutional views travel when the institution prefers not to appear to have views. Through the private communications of the relevant officials, through the conversations that the palace conducts with governments and churches when the palace needs to understand what the governments and churches are prepared to do, through the quiet assessment of a situation by people whose job is to assess situations quietly. What they were assessing was complicated. The complication had 3 components, each of which was sufficient on its own to generate significant institutional concern, and which together produced something that the palace understood, in the autumn of 1977, was going to require careful and sustained management. The first component was the SS. The discovery that Marie Christine's father had been a member of the SS was not a discovery that arrived by surprise to the palace. The palace conducted the relevant investigations before the relevant questions became public, because the alternative to conducting them first was having them conducted by the press, and the press conducting them first was not a scenario the palace found acceptable. The investigations found what they found, which was Gunther von Reibnitz's membership in the Nazi Party and his SS rank, and what they found was communicated through the appropriate channels to the appropriate people, and the appropriate people formed their views. The views were not favorable. This is not surprising. Britain in 1977 was 32 years from the end of the Second World War, which sounds like sufficient distance for historical perspective, and was, in the lived experience of the people who had survived the war and were still alive, and were still, in many cases, carrying its specific costs, not sufficient distance at all. The war was history in the sense that the events had concluded. It was not history in the sense of being past, in the way that genuinely past things are past, distant, resolved, processed into the general background of what preceded the present. Prince Michael's grandmother had been Queen Mary. The royal family had navigated the specific difficulty of their German connections throughout the 20th century, with the periodic revision of their name, from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor in 1917, and with the careful management of a family history that contained more German lineage than the wartime image of the monarchy was organized around acknowledging. The institution had managed this with the efficiency it brought to managing things it preferred not to discuss. The discovery that the woman Prince Michael intended to marry was the daughter of an SS officer was not the kind of thing the institution could manage through the simple mechanism of not discussing it. It was the kind of thing the press would discuss, loudly and at length, and the institution needed to be positioned appropriately when the discussion began. The second component was the Church. Marie Christine was Catholic. Prince Michael was a member of the Church of England. The Act of Settlement of 1701, which governed the succession to the British throne, prohibited members of the royal family from marrying Catholics, on the grounds that the original constitutional settlement of the post-Stuart monarchy required the exclusion of Catholic claimants, and that permitting the heirs of the throne to marry Catholics was an unacceptable risk to that exclusion. The Act of Settlement in 1977 was not the Act of Settlement of 1701 in any practical constitutional sense. The specific circumstances that had produced it had long since ceased to be operationally relevant, and the provision regarding Catholics had acquired the quality of a historical artifact that everyone understood was anachronistic, and nobody had yet been sufficiently motivated to remove from the statute books. Nobody had been sufficiently motivated because the occasion for motivation had not arisen. The occasion was arising now. Prince Michael was not in the line of succession in any meaningful practical sense. His position was sufficiently remote that the constitutional significance of his marriage was theoretical rather than operative. But theoretical constitutional significance is still constitutional significance, and the institution was not prepared to proceed without engaging with it. The engagement produced the conclusion that had been visible from the beginning. Prince Michael would need to renounce his place in the succession in order to marry a Catholic. The renunciation was manageable. It was not small. It was the formal removal of a member of the royal family from the line of succession, a constitutional step that required the relevant processes and the relevant approvals. But it was manageable in the way that the institution manages things when managing them produces less difficulty than the alternative. He agreed to renounce. He would renounce his place in the succession. The marriage could proceed on this condition. The third component was the annulment. The Catholic Church had granted Marie Christine an annulment of her marriage to Thomas Troubridge. The annulment was a sacramental determination, the Church had found, on the grounds it considered adequate, that the first marriage had not been a valid marriage in the sacramental sense, and had therefore never constituted the indissoluble bond that valid Catholic marriages constitute. She was, in the Church's accounting, free to marry again. The Church of England did not recognize the Catholic annulment. This was not a surprising position. The two churches had been in theological disagreement on numerous points since 1534, and the validity of each other's sacramental determinations was not an area in which agreement had been reached. What the Church of England recognized was that Marie Christine had been married, that the marriage had ended, and that in the Church of England's understanding of the situation, she was therefore a divorced woman. The Church of England in 1977, regarding the marriage of divorced persons, maintained the position it had maintained in October 1955, when Geoffrey Fisher had communicated his views about Peter Townsend. It did not remarry divorced persons in church. This meant that Prince Michael and Marie Christine could not marry in a Church of England ceremony. They could marry in a civil ceremony. This was the accommodation available, and it was the accommodation they used. They married in a civil ceremony in Vienna in June 1978, and were therefore married in the eyes of the state, and not, in the eyes of either church, married in the eyes of the Church. The Catholic Church's position was additionally complicated by the requirement, operative in 1978, that Catholic parties to a mixed marriage promised to raise their children as Catholics. Prince Michael was not Catholic, and the promise was not one he was going to make, which meant that the Catholic Church did not bless the marriage, and that Marie Christine, in marrying outside the Church, without the dispensation that the promise would have enabled, was placing herself in a complicated relationship with the institution whose membership was one of the defining facts of her identity. She managed this complication with the specific pragmatism she brought to most complications, by continuing to identify as Catholic, by continuing to attend Mass, and by waiting for the Church's position on the specific requirements around mixed marriages to evolve in the direction of greater pastoral flexibility, which it eventually did, at which point the marriage received the blessing that it had not received in 1978. The blessing came in 1983. In the meantime, they were married. The wedding was in Vienna on the 30th of June, 1978. Vienna was Marie Christine's choice, the city that represented the European aristocratic world she had been formed in the image of, that had the specific historical weight she wanted her wedding to carry, that was emphatically not the English institutional setting, that would have made the occasion the institution's occasion rather than hers. This is the first instance of what would become a recurring pattern in Marie Christine's relationship with the royal family. her consistent preference for organizing significant events in ways that reflected her own priorities, rather than the institutions, her willingness to make choices that placed her personal sense of what was appropriate above the institutional sense of what was expected. The institution noticed this. The institution had noticed it from the beginning, in the quiet way that institutions notice things about the people entering them who are not fully organized around the institution's preferences. The palace did not attend the wedding in significant numbers. The Queen sent a message. The representation of the royal family at the Vienna ceremony was not the representation that a wedding of a more straightforwardly institutional character would have generated. This was partly the practical difficulty of a foreign civil ceremony with complex religious complications. It was also, and the people paying attention understood this, a communication, the institution communicating, through the specific calibration of its visible support, what its relationship to this marriage was. The relationship was one of acceptance rather than enthusiasm. The acceptance was real. The Queen accepted the marriage. The renunciation was accepted. The title was confirmed. Marie Christine became Her Royal Highness Princess Michael of Kent, which was the title available to the wife of Prince Michael, and which she received and used with the specific appreciation of someone for whom titles carry the weight her formation had taught her they carry. The enthusiasm was qualified. Prince Michael and Princess Michael moved into Kensington Palace, the palace that was the residence of various members of the extended royal family, and that would eventually become the residence of Prince and Princess of Wales, and of Harry and Meghan, and that was, in 1978, a building containing a collection of royals and royal adjacents, whose relationships to each other were managed within the specific social architecture of people who live in proximity without having chosen to live in proximity. Princess Michael was in Kensington Palace now. The palace, both the building and the institution, was going to have to manage what that meant. The management was going to be more demanding than either party had fully anticipated. Princess Michael had arrived. She was 6 feet tall and extraordinarily beautiful, and absolutely convinced of her own significance, and she was in the building, and she had the title, and she was not, by any assessment of the qualities she had brought to Vienna in June 1978, and that she was now bringing to Kensington Palace, going to be managed in the way that the institution managed the people within it, who found the institutional management natural. The institutional management had always found people who found it natural. The people who found it natural were, in the main, the people who had grown up inside the institution and who had absorbed its requirements as the background condition of what being themselves meant. They had not decided to be managed. They simply were, because the institution had formed them, and the forming had produced people whose instincts and the institution's requirements were aligned. Princess Michael had not grown up inside the institution. She had grown up in Mozambique, and in convent schools, and in London, in the 1960s, and in the world of the Austrian baroness, she was by birth, and she had absorbed the requirements of that world, and that formation, with the same completeness that the people born inside the institution had absorbed its requirements. The requirements were different. What her formation had produced was someone who moved through the world as though the world owed her the recognition of her significance. What the institution required was someone who moved through the world as though the institution's significance was the primary significance, and their own was secondary to it. These are not compatible orientations. The incompatibility would produce, across the following 4 decades, the specific sequence of incidents and controversies and recoveries and further incidents that the press would cover with the enthusiasm reserved for someone who keeps giving you material, and the public would follow with the combination of fascination and judgment that attaches to someone who keeps doing the unexpected thing in a world organized around the expected. Princess Michael kept doing the unexpected thing. Sometimes the unexpected thing was the wrong thing. Sometimes it was simply the thing she wanted to do rather than the thing the institution preferred, which in the institutional calculus amounts to the same as the wrong thing. And sometimes it was, in the honest assessment of what she actually was, rather than what the institutional management of her required her to be, exactly the right thing, the expression of a genuine intelligence and a genuine personality in an environment that did not always have room for either. She was in the building. The institution was about to find out what that meant. The Kensington Palace of 1978 was not a single household, but a collection of households occupying the same historic building, organized around the specific social architecture of extended royal family life, which is to say, organized around the careful management of proximity between people who were related to each other by blood or marriage, and who had varying degrees of warmth for each other, and who were required, by the institutional logic of their shared address, to maintain the appearances of a coherence that the private reality did not always support. Princess Markle arrived into this architecture and immediately produced a disruption in it that the architecture had not been designed to absorb. The disruption was not malicious. It was not strategic. It was simply the result of introducing into a system organized around specific assumptions a person who did not share those assumptions and who was not going to pretend to share them on the grounds that pretending was what the system required. The specific assumption that Princess Markle most consistently declined to share was the assumption that underpinned the entire social operation of the royal family, the assumption of the primacy of the institution. The royal family operated on the understanding that the institution was the primary thing and the individuals within it were secondary to it, that the collective significance of the crown outweighed the individual significance of any member, and that the management of the individual's presentation was always in service of the collective image rather than the individual's own priorities. Princess Markle did not operate on this understanding. She operated on a different understanding entirely, the understanding installed in her by her mother in Mozambique, refined through the European aristocratic world she had moved through in London and Vienna, and expressed through the specific carriage and the specific confidence of someone who had decided, at a fundamental level, that she was significant because of who she was, rather than because of the institution she had married into. This produced, in practical terms, a series of situations that the palace found requiring management. The management began almost immediately. In the early months of her tenure as Princess Markle of Kent, the palace began to receive reports, through the informal channels that the palace uses for the monitoring of its members' public conduct, that Princess Markle was presenting herself in ways that generated comment. Not scandal, not in those early months, but comment. The comment had a consistent theme. She was more visible than the wives of minor royals were expected to be, more present at occasions where her presence was not strictly required, more forthcoming in her opinions to the journalists who covered the royal family, more willing to occupy the foreground in situations where the institutional expectation was that members of her specific category, the spouses of non-working royals, were expected to occupy the background. The palace communicated its preferences through the appropriate channels. The appropriate channels, in the case of Princess Markle, were less effective than they typically were, because the communication of institutional preferences requires the recipient to be organized around the institution's priorities, and Princess Markle was organized around her own. She heard the preferences. She processed them through her own understanding of what was appropriate. She continued. The press, which had been covering the royal family for long enough to understand the specific significance of deviation from the institutional norms, noticed what was happening and began to cover it with the enthusiasm of people who have found a consistent source of good material. The material was Princess Markle of Kent. She spoke to journalists in ways that the royal family's other members did not speak to journalists, with opinions, with the specific directness of someone who believes her views are worth having and therefore worth expressing, with the confidence that the journalism of the royal beat rarely encountered from its subjects. She spoke about art, in which she was genuinely knowledgeable. She spoke about history, in which she had done serious reading and had specific, developed views. She spoke about her own life, with the willingness to make it interesting that the institutional culture of the palace specifically prohibited and that she appeared entirely unaware was prohibited. The name arrived relatively quickly, Princess Pushy. The tabloid press coined it with the efficiency of people who have found the perfect compression of a story. 2 words, alliterative, immediately comprehensible, carrying in their combination the specific charge of a woman who exceeds what is expected of her and who is not sufficiently apologetic about the exceeding. The name required no explanation. It arrived and stuck and remained, for the following 4 decades, the primary frame through which Princess Markle was received by the British public. She hated it. She said so, repeatedly, and in the direct manner of someone who finds the alternative to saying so, the performing of indifference to what is said about her, less available than most public figures find it. She was not a person who performed indifference convincingly. She was a person who felt things fully, and whose feelings, when they were strong enough, found expression in her face, and her voice, and her words, in ways that the institutional training that produced, performed indifference in the people around her, had never been applied to her. She felt the name, as the injustice she believed it was. She said so. The saying so generated more coverage. The more coverage generated more material for the name. The cycle was self-reinforcing in the way of media cycles that have found a reliable engine and that run on it for as long as the engine keeps producing. The engine kept producing. The first significant public controversy arrived in 1985. A journalist named reporter for the Daily Mirror, the paper that had been covering the royal family with varying degrees of enthusiasm since before the war, and that found in Princess Markle a subject that its particular appetite for a certain kind of royal story was ideally suited to, published the information about Günther von Reibnitz, the SS membership, the rank, the specific biographical facts about Princess Markle's father, that the palace had known since before the marriage, and that had been managed, through the mechanism of not discussing them, with what the palace had assumed was sufficient effectiveness. It was not sufficient effectiveness. The facts were now in the public record, in the specific and irrevocable way that things enter the public record when the tabloid press decides the public needs to know them. The Daily Mirror had the documentation. The documentation was real. The story was accurate in its factual content. The SS membership and the rank were not invented, were not distortions of a more innocent reality, were what they appeared to be. The question of what the revelation required from Princess Markle was the question that the coverage organized itself around in the days that followed. The revelation required a response. The response required honesty. The honesty required that Princess Markle engage with the facts of her father's history in a way that acknowledged what those facts were, while also distinguishing her own person from his choices, a distinction that was morally correct, and also, in the specific atmosphere of Britain in 1985, where the war was still sufficiently present in the national memory to make the SS not simply a historical category, but an emotionally charged one, a distinction that required more careful management than Princess Markle had available to her. She gave a press conference. The press conference was, by the standards of how the royal family manages significant public relations difficulties, unusual in itself. The royal family did not typically respond to press controversies through press conferences, because press conferences create the conditions for follow-up questions, and follow-up questions create the conditions for the situation to develop in directions the person giving the conference cannot control. Princess Markle gave the press conference because she was not a person who could manage the silence that the institutional preference for not engaging required, and because she believed, with the conviction of someone who has never found silence to be an adequate response to an accusation she considers unjust, that she should say something. She said that she had not known the full extent of her father's wartime activities when she married Prince Michael. She said that she was deeply shocked by the revelations. She said that she condemned everything the Nazis had represented. The statement was received with the specific mixture of sympathy and skepticism that statements of this kind receive. The sympathy was genuine, the specific sympathy of people who understood that a person cannot choose their parents, and who found in Princess Markle's visible distress something recognizably human. The skepticism was also genuine, the specific skepticism of people who found it difficult to believe that a woman of Princess Markle's evident historical knowledge and evident interest in her own family's background had been unaware of the central fact of that background. The full truth of what Princess Markle knew, and when she knew it, is in the interior where such truths reside, when the person who holds them has not made them public. What the available record shows is that the press conference produced, in the immediate term, a period of reduced coverage intensity. The tabloids, having published the story, received the response, and moved on in the way of tabloids that have extracted the material available from a situation and are looking for the next one. The reduced coverage intensity was temporary. Princess Markle continued to be Princess Markle. which meant she continued to generate material, and the material continued to generate coverage, and the coverage continued to generate the name, and the name continued to attach itself to her in the way of names that have found their subject and have no intention of releasing it. The palace watched. It watched with the specific quality of attention that the palace brings to situations it is managing without appearing to manage. The careful monitoring of a member whose conduct was consistently at the edge of what the institutional tolerance for individual expression permitted, who kept not quite crossing the line into something that required formal intervention, who kept generating exactly the kind of coverage the institution found most difficult to address, because it was not wrong in any specific way that could be corrected, but was simply more than the institution preferred. More than the institution preferred was Princess Michael's natural register. It was the only register she had. She had been formed in it, and she could not turn it off, and the institution could not turn it off, and the press found it extremely good value, and the public found it entertaining, and sometimes appalling, and sometimes both simultaneously, and she continued in it through the 1980s and into the 1990s, with the specific consistency of someone who is simply being who they are, and finding the world's objections to who they are genuinely incomprehensible. She was, in her own understanding of herself, the wronged party. She had married a prince, she had received a title, she had moved into Kensington Palace, and occupied the position available to her with the enthusiasm and the energy of someone who finds the position genuinely interesting, and who brings to the occupation of it the full force of who she is. She had tried to be useful to the charitable work, to the public occasions, to the general project of being a visible and active member of the extended royal family. The institution had received all of this and had responded to it with the nickname and the management and the consistent communication through the channels the institution uses for such communication, that the way she was being herself was not the way the institution needed her to be herself. She had tried to adjust and had found the adjusting beyond her, not because she was incapable of adjustment in general, she was a highly adaptable person in many respects, but because the specific adjustment required was the adjustment of her fundamental character, and fundamental character is not the thing that adjusts. It is the thing that remains when everything else has been adjusted away. What remained, through the adjustments and the press conferences and the name and the management, was Princess Michael. She was more than the institution wanted. She was exactly as much as she had ever been. The book appeared in 1982, Princess Michael of Kent, 4 years into her marriage to Prince Michael, and still in the process of establishing what her relationship to the royal family was going to look like over the long term, published a work of popular history called Crowned in a Far Country. It was about the foreign-born queens of England, the women who had come from other countries and other cultures to marry into the English monarchy, and who had navigated, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of welcome, the specific challenge of becoming English enough for the role, while remaining whoever they had been before the role found them. The subject was not accidental. Princess Michael was not a woman who chose subjects accidentally. She was a woman of genuine historical knowledge and genuine intellectual engagement with the world, and the subject she had chosen for her first published work was a subject that bore an obvious relationship to her own experience, and she was herself a foreign-born woman who had married into the English monarchy, who was navigating with her own specific degree of success and her own specific degree of welcome the challenge of becoming whatever the role required while remaining who she actually was. The parallel was not subtle. The press noted it with the enthusiasm of people who find the parallel between a book's subject and its author's life too good to ignore. The coverage of the book's publication was partly coverage of the book, which was, by the critical assessment of the people who assessed such things, a solid and readable piece of popular history, well researched and engagingly written, demonstrating the genuine historical knowledge she claimed, and producing something of actual value to the reader, and partly coverage of what the book revealed about Princess Michael's self-understanding. What it revealed was extensive. She understood herself as belonging to a tradition. The foreign-born queens she wrote about were, in her reading of them, women who brought something to the English monarchy that the English monarchy would not have had without them, a perspective, a cultural breadth, a specific form of intelligence and character that the insularity of the purely English succession would not have produced. They were not problems the monarchy had managed, they were assets it had sometimes failed to recognize. She was, in her own self-understanding, an asset. The institution did not entirely share this self-understanding. This was the central and continuing tension of Princess Michael's position, the gap between how she understood herself and how the institution understood her, between the significance she brought to the role and the significance the role permitted her to express, between the person she was and the person the institution needed her to be. She kept writing. The book was the first of several. She followed Crowned in a Far Country, with a novel set in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the world of her ancestors, the specific Central European aristocratic world that she carried in her formation and that she returned to, in the fiction, with the specific pleasure of someone inhabiting the territory most naturally hers. Then another work of popular history, then another novel. The writing gave her what the royal role did not quite give her, a domain that was entirely hers, in which the assessment was of what she produced, rather than of whether what she produced conformed to the institutional preference. She was a published author. The books sold. The reviews were mixed in the way that the reviews of books by people famous for other things are always mixed. Some reviewers evaluating the work on its merits and finding them genuine, others evaluating it through the frame of who the author was and finding the frame more interesting than the work. She was not discouraged by the mixed reviews. Discouragement was not one of Princess Michael's characteristic responses. She had a quality of sustained self-belief that the discouragements of the preceding years, the nickname, the SS revelation, the managed distance of the institution, had not substantially dented, and the mixed reviews of her books were processed through the same quality and produced the same result, which was continuation. She continued writing. She also, through the 1980s, continued being Princess Michael of Kent in public, which meant she continued to generate the coverage that the name generated, and the incidents that the coverage documented, with the enthusiasm it had always brought to her. The incident of 1995 was the most discussed of the decade. In June 1995, Princess Michael was at a restaurant in New York. The specific restaurant is in the record. It was a Manhattan establishment of sufficient reputation that the presence of a member of the British royal family was the kind of thing that generated attention. The attention was being generated when, at some point during the evening, Princess Michael asked the diners at a neighboring table to be quiet. This is the bare fact. The complication of the bare fact is who the diners at the neighboring table were. They were African American. They were, by the accounts of the people involved, not being unreasonably loud. They were engaged in the ordinary conversation of people at a restaurant, which is to say, they were talking at the volume that restaurants are designed to contain. The request to be quiet was therefore not, by any honest accounting, a request that the situation required. It was, by the accounting of the people it was directed at, something else. The story reached the press with the speed of stories that confirm an existing narrative, the existing narrative being the one that the coverage of Princess Michael had been constructing since the mid-1980s, the narrative of a woman whose relationship to the conventions of acceptable public conduct was unreliable, and who expressed this unreliability in ways that the public found revealing about who she actually was. The racial dimension of the specific incident gave the narrative a sharper edge than most previous incidents had provided. The question the coverage asked was not simply whether Princess Michael had been rude in a restaurant, which was the kind of question the coverage had been asking since she arrived in Kensington Palace, and which had generated consistent coverage without generating the level of serious public concern that this incident generated. The question the coverage asked was whether the rudeness was connected to race. Princess Michael denied the racial dimension. She denied it with the specific forcefulness of someone who found the accusation unjust, and whose experience of finding accusations unjust was extensive enough that she had the specific vocabulary of the unjustly accused available to her. She said she had asked the table to be quieter because they were being loud. She said the request had nothing to do with who they were. She said she would have made the same request of any table that was disturbing her dinner. This may have been true. It may have been the complete account of what had happened, and what had motivated what happened. The interior of Princess Michael's motivations is, as the interiors of people's motivations always are, not accessible to external verification. What was accessible to external observation was the pattern. The pattern of incidents that had accumulated across the years of her public life, the comments that had been reported, the conduct that had generated coverage, the specific texture of a public presence that consistently produced situations requiring management, gave the coverage of the New York incident a context that the incident alone would not have had. Context is not proof. The pattern is not evidence that the specific incident was what the coverage suggested it was. But the context shaped the reception of the incident in ways that the denial could not entirely undo, and the reception became part of the record, and the record became part of the accumulated understanding of who Princess Markle was. She was aware of this. She was not, for all the qualities that the coverage had made familiar, an unintelligent woman, and she understood what the accumulation of the record meant for the question of how she was seen. She understood it, and she found it unjust, and she said she found it unjust, and the saying of it generated more coverage, and the coverage generated more of the record she found unjust. The cycle continued. She was also, through the mid-1990s, going through a period of personal difficulty that the press was covering with the thoroughness it brought to the personal difficulties of people it had decided were fair game for that thoroughness. The difficulty was a relationship. Ward Hunt was an American property developer who had known Princess Markle since the 1980s, and whose friendship with her had been, by the press's accounting of it, more than friendship, in the way that the press accounts for relationships between married women and men who are not their husbands. The accounting may or may not have been accurate. The interior of what the relationship actually was remains in the interior, where the relevant parties kept it. What the exterior showed was the coverage, the photographs of Princess Markle and Ward Hunt at various occasions, the reporting of the relationship in the specific terms that such reporting uses when it believes it has found evidence of something the people involved are not confirming. Princess Markle did not confirm. Prince Michael did not confirm. The palace did not confirm. The relationship continued to be photographed and reported on through the mid-1990s and into the early 2000s, generating the coverage that it generated, without the confirmation or denial that would have resolved it in any direction. Princess Markle managed it in the way she managed most things, by continuing to be present and active and fully operational in the public role, while maintaining the private record as private, which was, in the specific circumstances, the most the situation permitted. She was, in these years, also managing the relationship with the institution that had been the primary ongoing project of her life since June 1978. The relationship had settled into a specific form by the mid-1990s, not the warm inclusion that she had perhaps anticipated when she married Prince Michael, not the institutional rejection that the more dramatic readings of the palace's attitude toward her implied, but something in between, which was the specific tolerance of an institution for a member it cannot manage and has concluded it must therefore manage around. The managing around had a practical expression. Princess Markle and Prince Michael were not working royals. They were not on the civil list in the formal sense that gave working royals their income from the state. They supported themselves through their own means, through the books, through the various commercial activities that occupied Prince Michael's professional life, through the business of being who they were in the world that people of their specific position inhabit. This financial independence was both a source of freedom and a source of difficulty. The freedom was the freedom of not being entirely dependent on the institution's goodwill for the material conditions of their life. The difficulty was the difficulty of maintaining the life appropriate to their position, a position that required a certain scale of existence, certain residences, certain standards of what was visible, without the institutional support that the working royals received and that made their visible scale of existence possible. They borrowed money from the Crown estate. The borrowing became public in the late 1990s, in the specific way that the financial arrangements of minor royals become public, through the reporting of people who find such arrangements interesting and the confirmation of people who confirm them. The coverage was not flattering. The coverage of Princess Markle was rarely flattering, and the coverage of minor royals borrowing from the Crown estate while maintaining the external appearance of the life appropriate to their position was the kind of story that the press found reliably engaging. She managed it. She managed it by continuing, by being present at the occasions that required presence, by writing the next book, by doing the charitable work, by occupying the space available to her with the fullness of character that the space had never quite been large enough to contain. The space had never been large enough. She had understood this from relatively early in the marriage, and she had chosen, consistently and without apparent revision of the choice, to occupy it fully anyway. The choosing of fullness in a space too small for it is either courage or blindness, or a combination that makes the two indistinguishable. Princess Michael, through the 1990s, was making the choice so consistently that the question of whether it was courage or blindness had become, for the people watching her make it, beside the point. She was making the choice. The institution was managing the consequences. The press was covering both. The 2000s brought Princess Michael to a different kind of attention than the decades before had provided. The attention the 1980s and 1990s had given her was the attention of the tabloid press, specific, incident-driven, organized around the next thing she had done or said that the coverage could frame within the established narrative of Princess Pushy. It was not, in the main, the attention of serious historical or cultural analysis. It was the attention of people who had found a reliable source of material and who returned to the source as often as the source produced. The 2000s produced a different kind of engagement. Partly, this was the function of time. The accumulation of decades of public life gives a person a history, and history, even the specific history of someone whose public life has been consistently framed through the lens of their excesses and their controversies, invites a different kind of engagement than the immediate incident does. You can step back from the accumulation and see the shape of it in ways that you cannot see the shape of a single incident. The shape of Princess Michael's public life, when you stepped back from the accumulation, was more interesting than the coverage had suggested. What the coverage had consistently suggested was a woman whose defining qualities were her overreach and her controversies, the name and the father and the New York restaurant, and the various incidents that had generated coverage across the years. What the stepping back revealed was a woman of genuine complexity, whose relationship to the institution she had married into was the most honest illustration available of what the institution actually required of the people within it. She had tested those requirements by being unable or unwilling to meet them, and the testing had revealed the requirements more clearly than the people who met them without difficulty could have revealed them. The institution required the subordination of the individual to the collective image. It required the performance of a specific kind of public presence, composed, measured, always secondary to the crown. It required that the people within it find their significance in their relationship to the institution rather than in themselves. These requirements were real and were not unreasonable for the specific purpose they served. The institution's function, the embodiment of continuity, the performance of permanence, the symbolic anchoring of the nation's identity in something that persisted through the changes around it, required exactly this kind of disciplined subordination of the individual. Princess Michael could not give it, not because she was malicious or careless or indifferent to the institution's needs, because the formation she had received in Mozambique and the convent schools and the European aristocratic world of the 1960s had produced in her an understanding of her own significance that was prior to the institution and that the institution had not been able to replace. This was the honest account of what the preceding decades had contained, not a story of a terrible woman who kept causing problems for a patient institution, a story of a genuine incompatibility between a specific formation and a specific requirement that had played out across 30 years of public life in the specific incidents and the specific coverage that the incompatibility generated. The 2000s also brought new incidents, because Princess Michael continued to be Princess Michael, and Princess Michael continued to generate material, and the material continued to be what the material had always been, the expression of someone who exceeded what the institution wanted from her, and who exceeded it consistently and without apparent moderation. The most significant incident of the decade for the public understanding of Princess Michael was not the brooch of December 2017. That belongs to the following decade and will be discussed in its proper place. It was the publication in 2004, of the research that suggested significant portions of her second book, A Modest Royalty, a biography of Queen Consort Anne of Denmark, had been taken from other historians' work without adequate acknowledgement. The allegation was plagiarism. Plagiarism, in the context of a member of the royal family who had built a public identity partly around her intellectual seriousness, was not a small allegation. It went to the center of the claim she had been making about herself since the first book appeared in 1982, the claim that she was genuinely learned, genuinely engaged with historical material, genuinely producing something of value from her own intellectual engagement with the subject. The allegation suggested that the value had been produced from other people's intellectual engagement with the subject. She denied it. She denied it with the characteristic forcefulness of the unjustly accused, which was the register she had been operating in since 1985, and which she deployed now with the same conviction she had brought to the earlier denials. She said the similarities between her text and the texts of other historians were the result of drawing on the same primary sources, rather than the result of copying from the secondary literature. This was a defense that had a degree of plausibility in the specific technical sense that people who work with the same historical sources will sometimes produce similar sentences about those sources. It was also a defense that required the reader to believe that the similarities were more numerous and more specific than that technical possibility fully explained. The academic historians who examined the material were not persuaded by the defense. The publisher acknowledged problems with the sourcing. The book was withdrawn from sale temporarily while corrections were made. The corrections were made. The book was reissued with improved acknowledgements of the sources it had drawn from. The incident was managed, in the institutional sense of being processed and concluded and filed. It was not managed in the reputational sense, the reputation of someone who has published multiple books as a demonstration of intellectual seriousness does not recover cleanly from a finding that the intellectual seriousness was insufficiently careful about the distinction between reading and borrowing. The finding became part of the public understanding of Princess Michael, part of the accumulated record, part of the context through which subsequent things she said and did were received. She continued writing. She published The Serpent and the Moon in 2004. In the same year, the plagiarism controversy was running. The book was about Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of Henry II of France, a woman of remarkable beauty and political intelligence, who had maintained her position at the French court through decades of genuine power, and who had been, in the specific territory of the royal courts of the 16th century, exactly the kind of woman whose story Princess Michael found worth telling. The subject was, again, not accidental. Diane de Poitiers was a woman who had operated in a world not designed for women of her specific qualities to operate in, who had maintained her position through intelligence and through the specific kind of determination that does not revise itself in the face of the resistance it encounters. She had been, in the French court's accounting of her, more than the court wanted and exactly as much as she was. Princess Michael found this worth writing about. The critics noted the parallel with the author's own situation. She appeared on the publicity circuit for the book with the same confidence she brought to everything public. The television interviews, the book signings, the events at which she was the person the audience had come to see, and who rewarded their attendance with the full force of the presence she had always brought to occasions that required her. She was 60 years old in 2005. She was still 6 feet tall. She was still extraordinarily striking in the specific way of someone whose appearance is so thoroughly the expression of who they are that its elements are inseparable from the person. The height and the bearing and the specific quality of a face that had been photographed for 30 years and that retained, at 60, the architecture that had made it extraordinary at 30. She was also, at 60, someone whose public life had accumulated enough history that the history was becoming its own subject. She had given interviews across the decades, not in the restrained, carefully managed style of the senior royals, who gave interviews rarely and with institutional oversight, but in the more forthcoming style of someone who had never found the restrained and managed style natural, and who had given interviews with the frequency of someone who found the occasion of being asked about herself genuinely engaging. The interviews had, over 30 years, produced a considerable archive of Princess Markle, on the record about Princess Markle. She had spoken about her childhood in Mozambique. She had spoken about her European formation and what it meant to her. She had spoken about her books and her historical interests. She had spoken about what it was like to be married into the British royal family from the outside, to come from a different world and be required to navigate a world whose requirements were not her formation's requirements. She had spoken, in some of these interviews, with a candor that the institutional preference found excessive. She had said things about the other residents of Kensington Palace that the other residents of Kensington Palace had not authorized her to say. She had said things about the institution that the institution had not authorized anyone to say. She had said things about herself that were at odds with the portrait the institution would have preferred to be the primary portrait. She said, in one interview that was quoted repeatedly in the coverage of the 2000s, that she had tried harder than anyone could imagine to be what the royal family needed, and had found that the trying was not sufficient, because what the royal family needed was not something she was capable of being, which was someone organized around the institution rather than around herself. This was the most honest thing she had said publicly about the situation she was in. It was received with the mixed response that her honest statements always received. Some people found in it the confirmation that she was, underneath the controversies, a woman worth taking seriously. Others found in it the confirmation of the portrait they had already formed, which was the portrait of someone who had never understood what was required of her. Both responses were, in different ways, accurate. She had not fully understood what was required. This is true. The requirements of the institution had not been clear to her in the specific way that they are clear to people who are formed inside the institution, and the learning of them through the encounters of 30 years had been a learning that came through the violation rather than through the internalization that makes violation unnecessary. She had also, and this is the part of the portrait that the coverage had consistently underemphasized, tried. She had tried in the specific way that someone tries when they are trying to be something that their formation has not equipped them to be. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with the specific lapses that result from trying to maintain the performance of a character that is not your natural character. The trying was real. The imperfection was real. The specific incidents that the coverage had documented were real. All three things were true simultaneously. The institution managed the three truths simultaneously, as it managed most things, by acknowledging what was unavoidable, managing what was manageable, and maintaining the performance of coherence that the institution's function required. Princess Markle continued in the space the institution provided. The space was not large. She filled it.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
The question of money runs through Princess Markle's story, with the persistence of a theme that the main narrative keeps trying to move past and that keeps returning, because money is not incidental to the story of someone who married into a position that carried the appearance of wealth without providing the substance of it. Prince Michael of Kent was not a wealthy man in the absolute sense that the position of prince suggested. He was a member of the royal family. He had a title. He had Kensington Palace as a residence, at a peppercorn rent, that represented a significant benefit in material terms, but that did not pay the household bills or fund the lifestyle that the title's associations created the expectation of. He was not on the civil list in the period that mattered. The sovereign grant that supports the working members of the royal family did not extend to Prince Michael, who was not a working royal in the formal sense, and whose income was therefore his own responsibility. His own responsibility was the income of a man who had some investments, some business interests, some commercial engagements that drew on the connection the title provided, and a wife whose books sold in respectable but not extraordinary numbers. The combination produced an income that was, by the standards of what the position visibly required, insufficient. The gap between the visible requirement and the available income was the source of the money question that ran through the 2000s and into the 2010s in the coverage of Princess Markle and Prince Michael. The gap had been managed, across the years, through various arrangements. The arrangement with the Crown Estate, the borrowing that had become public in the late 1990s, was one. The commercial engagements that Prince Michael pursued were another. The specific business of being a senior member of the extended royal family in a world where that specific position had commercial value was the primary method. The commercial value of the position is a subject the institution prefers not to discuss directly, because discussing it directly requires acknowledging that the position generates value that the people holding it can monetize, which requires acknowledging that the position is a commercial asset rather than purely a service, which complicates the narrative of the royal family as an institution of selfless public service. Prince Michael and Princess Michael monetized the commercial value of the position. They did this through the specific channels available to people in their specific situation, through the association of their names and their presence with commercial enterprises that found the association valuable, through the consultancy arrangements that Prince Michael maintained with various companies, through the speaking engagements and the appearances and the events that the title enabled. This was not unusual among the minor royals. It was the standard method by which members of the extended royal family, who were not supported by the sovereign grant, maintained the lifestyle the position required. What was unusual was the degree to which it became visible in Princess Michael's case, because Princess Michael was more visible than most minor royals, and the visibility of the method was therefore greater. The visibility peaked in 2004 when it was reported that Prince Michael had accepted payments for facilitating introductions to the then-President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The specific allegation that he had used his royal status to create commercial value by providing access to the Russian presidency for people who wanted access to the Russian presidency was damaging in the specific way that allegations about the commercial use of royal status are damaging. The palace distances itself. The palace expressed, through the appropriate channels, its view that the arrangement was inappropriate and that Prince Michael had been embarrassed by it, and that the arrangement had concluded. Prince Michael accepted this framing, and the arrangement concluded, and the matter was managed, in the way that matters involving minor royals are managed, when managing them is the available option. Princess Michael was not directly implicated in the Putin arrangement. Her involvement, if any, is not in the public record. What the public record shows is that she was married to the man at the center of the arrangement, and that the arrangement was a symptom of the underlying financial situation that was the background condition of both their lives. She continued writing in these years. She published The Serpent and the Moon in 2004, her book about Diane de Poitiers, and continued the pattern of historical research and popular narrative that had been her primary professional output since 1982. The books gave her something that the royal role and the commercial arrangements and the management of the institution's preferences could not give her, a domain of her own, defined by her own intelligence and her own interests, assessed on the merits of what she produced, rather than on whether the production conformed to the institutional requirement. She also, in these years, gave more of the interviews that had always been a primary form of her public expression. The interviews of the 2000s had a different quality from the interviews of the 1980s and 1990s. She was in her 60s now, and the decades had produced in her what decades sometimes produce in people who have been through a great deal. Not softening exactly, not the performed wisdom of someone who has decided that wisdom is the appropriate late-career persona, but a quality of considered reflection that was genuine rather than strategic. She spoke, in these interviews, about her childhood with more willingness to engage with its complications than she had shown in earlier decades. She spoke about her father with the specific combination of love and complexity that the children of complicated men bring to their parents, acknowledging the difficulty without surrendering the love, finding a way to hold both things without requiring either to cancel the other. She had not always been this specific about her father. The 1985 press conference had been the first public engagement with the SS facts, and it had been reactive, driven by the press's publication of the facts, rather than by her own initiative in raising them. The later interviews were more considered. She had had 20 years to think about how to talk about Günther von Reibnitz, and the thinking had produced a position that was more textured than the press conference had been. She spoke about her father as a man who had made choices she could not defend, and who had also been her father, who had been, in the specific and irreducible sense of being the person she had come from, a fact about her identity that she could neither choose nor abandon. She had not known him well. He had been mostly absent from her childhood, the separation from her mother preceding her earliest clear memories. What she had of him was the name and the title, and the genetic inheritance, and the historical record. The historical record she could not change. What she could do, and what the later interviews suggested she had done, was develop a relationship to the historical record that was honest rather than defensive, that acknowledged the facts without pretending they were other than what they were, and without allowing them to be the whole of what she was. This was, by the standards of how public figures typically manage family histories of this kind, more honest than most. It did not satisfy everyone. The people who had decided that the SS facts were sufficient to establish a final verdict about Princess Michael's character were not going to be satisfied by the later interviews' more textured engagement, because the verdict they had established did not require further evidence to maintain. She was not attempting to satisfy these people. She had stopped attempting to satisfy people whose satisfaction she had concluded was not available to her regardless of what she did. This was, by the standards of the managing of her public life she had been doing since 1978, a significant evolution, the specific evolution of someone who has spent decades trying to manage a reputation they cannot control, and who has finally arrived at the conclusion that the attempt to control it is less productive than the decision to ignore it. She had not entirely reached this conclusion. She was still, through the 2000s, someone who responded to coverage she found unjust, with the direct expression of finding it unjust. She was still someone who gave interviews in which she said more than the institution would have preferred, and who said it with the confidence of someone who had decided that the saying was her right, and that the institution's preference was the institution's preference and not hers. But the quality of the response had moderated, not because she had been broken by the decades of management and coverage and the name and the incidents. She had not been broken. She was not a person who broke, which was itself one of the qualities the coverage had documented across the decades, without quite naming it as a quality rather than a deficiency. She was still there. She was in her 60s, and she was still in the space the institution had never been large enough to contain her in, and she was still filling it with the fullness of character that filling it fully required, and the filling continued to generate the coverage that the fullness had always generated, and the coverage continued to maintain the portrait that the coverage had always maintained. The portrait was not wrong. It contained a woman who had overreached and caused incidents and generated management difficulties, and produced the name that she hated and the controversy that the name attracted. All of this was in the portrait. The portrait was also not complete. What was not in the portrait, or not in the portrait with the weight it deserved, was the woman who had written multiple books of genuine historical engagement, who had done charitable work with genuine commitment, who had occupied the space available to her with the energy and the presence of someone who found the occupation of available space genuinely worthwhile, and who had done all of this while navigating the specific difficulty of being a person of significant individual character in an institution that required the subordination of significant individual character to the collective image. The subordination had not been complete. The institution had required it, and she had not provided it, and the gap between the requirement and the provision had been the primary content of 30 years of coverage. The gap was real. So was the woman on the other side of it. The coverage had consistently found the gap more interesting than the woman. She had found the woman more interesting than the gap. The institution had found the gap the problem, and the woman the source of the problem, and had managed accordingly. All three things were true, and the truth of each of them did not cancel the truth of the others. This was where the story was in the 2000s, in the middle of the 30-year project of managing the incompatibility between a specific person and a specific institution, with neither the person nor the institution having resolved the incompatibility, and neither having the capacity to resolve it, because the incompatibility was structural, and structural incompatibilities do not resolve. They continue. They continued. The next decade would provide the clearest illustration of what the continuing looked like when it reached an occasion that concentrated all the elements of the incompatibility into a single image. The image was the brooch, but the brooch was still a decade away. For now, The continuing continued in the way that things continue when they have been established for long enough that the continuation is simply what is happening, the background condition, the ongoing state, the everyday reality of a woman who had been more than the institution wanted for 30 years, and who had every indication of continuing to be more for 30 years more. She was in her 60s. She had at least 30 more years of being more than the institution wanted in her. She intended to use them. The decade between 2010 and 2020 was the decade in which everything that had accumulated across the preceding 30 years arrived at a specific, visible, concentrated point. The point was December 2017, and the brooch outside it was the image that crystallized what 30 years of covered incidents and managed controversies had been building toward. The clearest, most unavoidable, most photographically permanent illustration of the gap between what Princess Michael understood herself to be doing and what the people observing her understood her to have done. But the brooch was the end of the decade, not its beginning, and the beginning of the decade is where the story properly resumes. Princess Michael was 65 in 2010. She was in the specific territory of late middle age that people of her generation and her constitution inhabit, with varying degrees of success, and she inhabited it with the success of someone whose primary qualities, the presence, the intelligence, the energy, are not primarily physical qualities and do not diminish at the rate of physical qualities as the years accumulate. She was still immediately striking. She was still immediately present in any room she entered. She was still producing the specific effect on the people around her that she had always produced, which was the effect of someone whose personality is so fully expressed in everything about them that you are aware of the person before you have had any specific interaction with the person. She was still writing. The books continued through the 2010s, another novel set in the Austro-Hungarian world that was her historical and emotional home, another work of popular history, the continuation of the project she had been engaged in since 1982. The writing was still the domain most completely hers, the space in which the institutional requirement of subordination did not apply because the institution had no claim on what she produced in the privacy of her study. She continued to give interviews. The interviews of the 2010s had a quality that was different from the interviews of any previous decade. She was in her 70s by the middle of the decade, and the 70s had given her what the 70s sometimes give people who have been through a great deal and who have developed, through the having been through it, a relationship to their own history that is more settled than the relationship of earlier decades. She spoke about the decades with a specificity and a candor that the earlier decades had not quite produced. She spoke about what it had been like to arrive in the royal family in 1978 with the formation she had, and to discover what the formation required of her and what the institution required of her, and to find that these requirements were not the same requirements. She spoke about the years of management and the name, and the incidents with the specific distance of someone who has processed the events sufficiently to discuss them without the reactive charge that made the earlier discussions of them feel like reopening wounds rather than examining history. She said she had made mistakes. This was itself a departure from the earlier mode, which had been consistently the mode of the unjustly accused, the mode that denied the validity of the accusations rather than acknowledging the component of validity they contained. The later interviews contained something more complicated than denial. They contained the acknowledgement that the situation had been genuinely difficult and that her management of it had been genuinely imperfect, and that the imperfection was not entirely the fault of the institution or the press or the people who had formed the name and the coverage. She had contributed to the situation. She said this: the saying of it was noticed in the coverage as a development, as evidence of the specific evolution that people undergo when they have lived with something long enough to see it clearly. The coverage of the acknowledgement was, for once, not the coverage of a new incident, but of a retrospective engagement with the accumulated incidents, and the retrospective engagement was received with a warmth that the incidents themselves had rarely received. She was also, through the 2010s, navigating the specific challenges of aging inside the royal family. The challenges were financial in part, continuing the thread that had run through the story since the beginning. The commercial arrangements that had supported the lifestyle were becoming more difficult to maintain as the commercial value of the position declined with the distance from the central members of the royal family. A position that had some commercial value when Prince Michael was a relatively prominent figure in the extended family, had less commercial value when the generation of the Queen's grandchildren was becoming the generation the public and the press were most interested in. The challenges were also social. The royal family of the 2010s was not the royal family of the 1970s in its composition or its dynamics. The generation that had been the senior generation in 1978, the Queen, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, was mostly gone by 2010. The generation that had been children in 1978 was now the primary generation, and their children were beginning to be visible, and the generation into which Princess Michael had married was not the primary generation anymore. She was a figure of the previous generation, in a family that was managed in the perpetual present of its current members. The previous generation is not irrelevant. The institution values continuity, and the previous generation is continuity. But it is not the primary object of attention, and the shift in attention was visible in the quality of the coverage that Princess Michael received in the 2010s relative to the coverage of the 1980s and 1990s. The coverage was less. Not absent, she continued to generate incidents that the press found worth covering, but less continuous, less immediate, more occasional. She was no longer the primary object of the specific attention she had received when she was new to the institution, and every expression of who she was news, because who she was itself news. She was no longer new. She was, by the 2010s, established, a fixed and familiar feature of the extended royal family's landscape, understood in her particular way, received with the combination of fondness and exasperation that the English public extends to people who have been reliably themselves for long enough that the reliability has become the primary quality. The fondness was not universal, the exasperation was not universal, but both were more present in the coverage of the 2010s than they had been in the coverage of the 1980s, when the primary response was the simpler response of a press that had found a story and was telling it without the complicating influence of time. Time had complicated things. Time had produced the specific relationship to Princess Michael that 3 decades of consistent character produces. You know what she is, you have opinions about what she is, the opinions are not simple, and the simplifications that served the early coverage no longer serve because the subject has become too familiar for simplifications to hold. She was too familiar now for the simplifications. She was also, and this is the part of the 2010s that the coverage found most interesting, becoming a figure that the cultural moment was reconsidering. The reconsideration was not dramatic and was not organized. It was the gradual shift in the way people engaged with Princess Michael's story that happens when enough time has passed for the original framing to feel insufficient. The original framing, Princess Pushy, the woman who couldn't be managed, the in-law the palace couldn't control, was not wrong, but it was increasingly insufficient as an account of what 35 years of being that person in that institution had actually contained. The insufficiency was noticed by the people who wrote about the royal family seriously, the biographers, the historians, the journalists who covered the beat with the long view rather than the immediate incident. These people began, in the 2010s, to produce accounts of Princess Michael that engaged with the complexity rather than the simplification. The complexity they engaged with was the complexity of a woman who had been more than the institution wanted, and who had paid for being more with the specific currency of reputation, who had been defined, for 35 years, by the gap between what she was and what the institution required, in a way that the people who met the requirement were not defined by the gap, because the gap, for them, did not exist. The people who meet the requirement are invisible as individuals precisely because the meeting of the requirement makes the individual invisible. The institution is what is visible. The person is what the institution needs rather than what the person is. Princess Michael had remained visible as a person throughout her time in the institution. This was the failure the institution had identified and managed. It was also, in the reconsidering of the 2010s, increasingly recognized as something else. as the survival of an individual identity inside an institution that is very good at absorbing individual identities, as the persistence of a specific character in the face of the institutional preference for a different kind of character. The reconsidering did not produce a revised official narrative. The institution does not revise its official narratives in response to the cultural reconsidering of individual members. It continues with the narrative it has, which is the narrative of an institution that is larger than its members and that manages its members accordingly. The narrative continued. Princess Markle continued within it. Then December 2017 arrived, and the brooch arrived with it, and the brooch concentrated everything that the 35 years had accumulated into a single image that would become the definitive image of what the accumulated 35 years had been about. The context of December 2017 was the context this account described at the beginning. The pre-Christmas lunch at Buckingham Palace. Meghan Markle, 3 weeks into her engagement to Prince Harry, the most scrutinized woman in Britain, seated in the same room as Princess Markle of Kent. Princess Markle had known Meghan Markle was going to be at the lunch. She had known what the lunch was and who was going to attend it and what the occasion represented. The first significant gathering of the extended royal family since the engagement had been announced. The occasion at which Meghan would meet the broader family and the broader family would meet Meghan. She had chosen to wear the blackamoor brooch. Whether the choice was deliberate, whether Princess Markle arrived at the lunch having selected the brooch with the full awareness of what it represented, and what wearing it to this specific lunch at this specific moment would communicate, or whether the choice was the more complicated thing, that the choices of people who have been generating incidents for 35 years sometimes are, which is the choice of someone who is not fully thinking through the implications of what they are choosing, is in the interior where choices reside before they become public. The brooch was on her coat when she arrived. The photograph captured it. The coverage was immediate. The brooch was a blackamoor piece, the specific genre of antique jewelry that depicts black figures in the decorative tradition of 18th century Europe, a tradition that is, by any contemporary understanding of its history and its symbolism, connected to the specific history of the African slave trade and the specific history of how European art and decoration produced representations of black people in the period when black people were most systematically dehumanized by European civilization. Wearing this piece of jewelry to a lunch at which Meghan Markle, who is biracial, whose mother is black, whose presence in the royal family was generating the racially inflected coverage that it was generating, was the most visible and most analyzed guest was not, by any honest assessment of what it communicated, a neutral choice. Whether it was an intentional choice or an unconscious one, the communication was the same. The apology arrived the following morning through Princess Markle's office. The apology said the brooch had been worn without any malicious intent. It said Princess Markle was deeply sorry for any offense caused. It was a relatively swift and relatively complete apology by the standards of her previous engagements with the requirement to apologize. It was not sufficient to close the story. The story could not be closed by an apology because the story was not simply about a brooch. The brooch was the specific incident, but the story was the accumulated 35 years, and the 35 years had produced, in the public understanding of Princess Markle, a context into which the brooch incident arrived, and in which it acquired a significance it might not have had in a different context. The context was the pattern. The pattern was the pattern the preceding 35 years had created, the incidents, the comments, the situations that had generated coverage, the coverage that had maintained the portrait. The brooch arrived into the pattern, and the pattern gave it a reading that the apology could not entirely undo. She was 72 years old in December 2017. She had been generating incidents for 35 years. The brooch was the most discussed incident of all of them. The aftermath of the brooch was not, by the standards of Princess Markle's previous aftermaths, unusually prolonged. The apology had been issued. The coverage had run its cycle. The specific combination of incident and response and follow-up commentary that the coverage of Princess Markle had always generated moved through its phases with the efficiency of a system that had been running the same cycle for 35 years and had become very practiced at it. What was different about the aftermath of December 2017 was not its duration, but its quality. The brooch incident arrived in a specific cultural moment, a moment in which the questions the brooch raised about race and representation and the specific history of images like the blackamoor were not the questions of a marginal critical discourse, but the questions of a mainstream public conversation that had been building across the preceding years and that had arrived, by December 2017, at a volume and a seriousness that made the engagement with those questions unavoidable in a way it might not have been in an earlier decade. The coverage of the brooch incident engaged with those questions. Not all of the coverage. Some of it was the standard coverage of a Princess Markle incident. The incident, the response, the brief flare of commentary, the file, and move on. But a significant portion of it engaged seriously with what the brooch was and what it represented and what it meant that it had been worn to this specific lunch at this specific moment in the specific context of Meghan Markle's arrival in the royal family. The engagement produced something that previous incidents had not quite produced, a sustained conversation about Princess Markle in terms that went beyond the established portrait. The established portrait was the portrait of Princess Pushy, the in-law the palace couldn't control, the woman who kept generating incidents. The brooch incident produced, alongside the established portrait, a conversation about what the incidents revealed, not simply about Princess Markle as an individual, but about the specific world she had been moving through for 35 years, and what that world's relationship to the questions the brooch raised actually was. This was a different kind of conversation. Princess Markle did not participate in it directly. She had issued the apology, and she maintained, after the apology, the silence that she was rarely able to maintain following incidents, but that the specific nature of this incident made the available option. There was nothing she could say in the aftermath that would improve on the apology, or that would not generate further coverage of a kind that would make the situation worse. She was quiet. The quiet was noticed. It was noticed partly because the quiet was unusual. She was not typically a quiet person in the aftermath of incidents, was typically the person who said too much in the aftermath of incidents, who gave the coverage the additional material it needed to extend the cycle. The quiet broke the cycle at its usual extension point, and the cycle concluded more quickly than it typically concluded. What did not conclude was the conversation the incident had opened about Princess Markle's position and what it illustrated about the institution. The conversation continued through the following year in the specific form of the coverage of Meghan Markle's integration into the royal family, which was itself the most sustained and most analyzed integration of a new member into the royal family since Princess Diana's arrival in 1981, and which generated, across 2018, an enormous volume of coverage and commentary that engaged with the questions the brooch had raised about race and the institution. Princess Markle appeared in this coverage as a recurring reference point, not as its primary subject, which was Meghan and Harry, but as an illustration of something the coverage was trying to say about the institution's relationship to race and difference. The illustration was not flattering. She was aware of the coverage. She was always aware of the coverage. She had been monitoring the coverage of herself since she arrived in the royal family in 1978, and the monitoring had been one of the consistent features of the 4 decades she had spent inside the institution. The specific attentiveness of someone whose public image was a primary professional concern, even when the concern was about managing an image she would have preferred not to have, rather than managing an image she was proud of. She managed it from Kensington Palace. The managing, in 2018, took the form of the continued quiet that had followed the brooch incident, a reduced public profile in the immediate aftermath, fewer of the interviews and appearances that had generated the coverage of previous years, a general pulling back from the visible surface of the public role that she occupied. The pulling back was not retreat. It was the tactical recognition that the available territory had contracted, and that operating within the contracted territory required operating at a smaller scale than the previous decades had required. She was 73 in 2018. The Kensington Palace of 2018 was not the Kensington Palace of 1978 in its occupants. The central figures had changed across the 40 years. The people who had been in the building when she arrived were mostly gone, replaced by the generation she had watched grow up as children and who were now the primary objects of public attention. William and Catherine were in the palace. Harry and Meghan were in the palace. In the brief period of their residence before the events of 2020 produced their departure, Princess Michael and Prince Michael were also in the palace. The palace contained, therefore, in 2018, the specific gathering of people that the institutional history of the preceding decades had produced. The heirs, the spouses of the heirs, the members of the generation that had been there since before the heirs were born, all of them navigating the specific social architecture of proximity to people they were related to by blood or marriage, and who they had not always chosen to be in proximity to. The architecture had never been entirely comfortable for Princess Michael. It was less comfortable in 2018 than it had been in most previous years, because the woman whose engagement had generated the brooch incident was now in the building, and the coverage of the woman in the building was the coverage that was defining the cultural moment, and the brooch had placed Princess Michael in a specific relationship to the coverage of that moment that was not the relationship she would have chosen. She navigated it. Navigating was what she had always done, the specific ongoing negotiation of a position that did not fully fit her with a world that had never fully accommodated her, conducted with the energy and the intelligence and the specific determination of someone who has decided that the navigation is the available option and who navigates accordingly. The navigation of 2018 was quieter than most previous navigations. This was, in itself, a form of development. The woman who had arrived in the royal family in 1978 and who had spent 4 decades generating coverage through the fullness of her expression of herself had arrived, at 73, at a version of the expression that was slightly less full, not diminished, not defeated, but calibrated in the way that things are calibrated when the calibration has been the product of experience rather than the product of imposed management. She had calibrated herself. The institution had not managed her into the calibration. The institution had never been able to manage her, which was the primary content of 4 decades of coverage. She had arrived at the calibration through her own processing of her own history, through the specific understanding of someone who has looked at 40 years of the same cycle and has concluded that some modification of the input is available, even if the modification of the output is not. She modified the input. The output continued to be Princess Michael of Kent, the person who had been more than the institution wanted since June 1978, and who would continue to be more than the institution wanted for as long as she remained herself. She remained herself. The institution continued. The coverage continued. The navigation continued. This was where the story was in 2018, in the middle of the ongoing negotiation that had been the primary content of 40 years, modified by the specific development of a woman who was 73 and who had arrived at a version of herself that was, in its specific calibration, slightly more sustainable than the versions of the preceding decades. Slightly more sustainable was not fully sustainable. The incidents would continue because the character that had produced the incidents had not been replaced by a different character. The brooch was the illustration of this, the incident that demonstrated that even the calibrated version of Princess Michael remained capable of producing the specific kind of incident that the uncalibrated version had been producing for decades. The calibration was real. The character was also real. Both of them were going to continue. The institution was going to have to continue managing both of them, as it had been managing both of them since June 1978, with the specific efficiency of an institution that has decided that the available option is management rather than resolution. Resolution was not available. The character and the institution were still incompatible. They had been incompatible for 40 years. They would continue to be incompatible for the remaining years of Princess Michael's life in the institution, because the incompatibility was structural, and structural incompatibilities do not resolve. They continue. The pandemic arrived in March 2020, and it arrived for everyone simultaneously, which is the specific quality of the kind of event that does not organize itself around the existing distinctions between people, between the prominent and the private, the wealthy and the struggling, the people who live in palaces and the people who live in one-room flats, but that imposes itself on all of them at once and leaves each of them to manage the imposition with whatever they have available. What Princess Michael had available was Kensington Palace, which was more than most people had available, and which was therefore not a hardship in any absolute sense, but which was, in the specific way that large and formal and institutional buildings become difficult when the ordinary structures of social life that make them habitable are removed, its own kind of challenge. The social life was the thing. For Princess Markle, who had been animated throughout her life by the specific energy of social engagement, by rooms and conversation, and the performance of being fully present in whatever gathering she was part of, the removal of the social life was the removal of the primary form of her self-expression. The interviews could not happen in the same way. The appearances and the events and the occasions that had always provided the stage for the expression of who she was were gone. The world contracted to the palace and the people within it. The people within it were not, in 2020, a straightforwardly comfortable community. Harry and Meghan had left for Canada in January and were in California by the summer, and their departure had produced the institutional management crisis that the preceding section described, and that had changed the atmosphere of Kensington Palace in the way that departures under complicated circumstances changed the atmosphere of shared spaces. William and Catherine were still there, managing their own version of the pandemic's demands, alongside the institutional demands that had always been theirs. Princess Markle and Prince Michael were still there. The cohabitation of these households in the specific circumstances of March 2020, through the end of the initial lockdown period, had the quality that the cohabitation of related people in shared spaces during a crisis always has, the proximity that is simultaneously too much and not enough, the intimacy that the shared circumstances impose and that the institutional formality of the setting does not entirely ease. She managed. She continued the writing. The writing was, in the circumstances, the most available form of the engagement with the world that the engagement with rooms full of people had temporarily replaced, and she applied herself to it with the specific discipline of someone who understands that the work is what continues when everything else has been suspended. She also, through the pandemic, continued to give interviews, not the in-person interviews that had been the primary form of the genre for 4 decades, but the remote interviews that the pandemic had produced as the available alternative. The remote interviews had their own specific character, which was the character of conversations conducted through the technology that made them possible, rather than through the unmediated presence that the best interviews require. She adapted to the remote format with the specific adaptability of someone who has been adapting to formats not entirely suited to her natural mode of expression for 40 years, and who has developed, through the adapting, a functional relationship to doing the thing available rather than the thing preferred. The remote interviews of the pandemic period were, in their specific content, consistent with the interviews of the preceding years, the same candor, the same engagement with the history of the preceding decades, the same willingness to say things that the institutional preference would not have endorsed. She spoke about the pandemic in terms that were consistent with how she spoke about everything, with opinions, with the specific directness of someone who has views and expresses them, without the performed neutrality that the institutional culture of the royal family required and that she had never been able to sustain. She had opinions about the lockdown regulations. She expressed them. The expressions were covered with the coverage that her expressions always received, the coverage that noted what she had said and placed it in the context of what she had been saying for 4 decades, and found in the combination the story that the coverage had always found in that combination. The story was Princess Markle being more than the institution wanted. It was still the story. The pandemic also produced, in Princess Markle's case, a specific engagement with her own mortality that the circumstances imposed on people of her age, with a directness that the circumstances of ordinary life rarely provide. She was 75 in 2020. Prince Michael was 77. They were in the specific demographic category that the initial reporting of the pandemic had identified as the category most at risk from the disease, the over 70s, whose underlying health vulnerabilities the virus exploited with the efficiency of something specifically designed to find and exploit such vulnerabilities. The palace arranged testing and the precautions that the circumstances required. The specific management of the health of the people in Kensington Palace during the pandemic is not in the public record with more detail than the management of such things typically is, which is to say, it is acknowledged in general terms and not described in specific ones. What is in the public record is that both Prince Michael and Princess Michael contracted COVID at some point during the pandemic period. The illness was serious in Prince Michael's case, requiring hospital treatment and producing a period of significant concern about his health. She was at his bedside. The accounts that exist of this period describe her in terms that are different from the terms that most of the coverage of her public life had used. Not as the woman who generated incidents and management difficulties and the coverage that the management difficulties produced, but as a wife. As someone who was frightened for her husband and who was present with the fear and who managed it in the way that people manage fears that are as large as the fear of losing the person they have been with for 40 years. Prince Michael recovered. The recovery produced the specific relief that recovery from serious illness produces in the people who love the person who has been seriously ill. Not the relief of the managed situation, but the relief of the actual thing, the embodied relief of a body returning to itself after the specific threat of not returning. She was relieved. She was also, in the aftermath of the illness, visibly changed in the specific way that proximity to the serious illness of a spouse changes people, more aware of the time available, more attentive to the value of the ordinary days that had preceded the crisis, and that the crisis had made suddenly and starkly visible as the things they actually were, which was all that was actually there. The ordinary days were what was there. She had spent 40 years making the ordinary days more than the institution wanted. She had spent 40 years generating the incidents and the coverage and the management and the name. She had spent 40 years being more than the space the institution provided could comfortably contain. The illness, and Prince Michael's recovery from it, produced a quality in the coverage of Princess Michael in the later pandemic period that was different from any previous quality of coverage. A warmth, cautious and unspectacular, the warmth that people extend to someone when the circumstances have revealed something about that person that the previous framing of them had obscured. What the circumstances had revealed was a woman who loved her husband. This was not new information. She had been married to Prince Michael since 1978, and the marriage had lasted through the Putin arrangement and the plagiarism controversy and the financial difficulties and the brooch incident and every other incident and arrangement and controversy that the 40 years had contained. The marriage had lasted because marriages that last through the specific difficulties this one had contained are marriages that are, at their foundation, something more substantial than the difficulties. The foundation was love. The coverage had rarely engaged with the foundation because the foundation was private, and the coverage engaged with the surface, and the surface was consistently the incident and the management and the name. The illness made the foundation briefly visible. The visibility was modest and was not sustained. It is the nature of illness-related warmth in press coverage that the warmth concludes when the illness concludes, and the established portrait reasserts itself as the primary frame. The established portrait reasserted itself. She remained the woman the established portrait described. She was also the woman the illness had briefly made visible. Both things were true. She was, by 2021, in the specific late period of her life in the institution, past the years of the primary incidents, past the years when the coverage was driven by the accumulation of new material, into the years when the coverage was increasingly the retrospective engagement with what the accumulation had been. The retrospective engagement was producing, in the writing about her that appeared in the 2020s, something more complicated than the established portrait. The biographers who were writing about the royal family of the late 20th century were writing about Princess Michael as a figure whose significance exceeded the incidents, who illustrated something about the institution that could not be illustrated by the people who met its requirements, because those people's invisibility as individuals was the evidence of the requirement's success rather than a subject for examination. She was a subject for examination because she had not met the requirement. The not meeting was the examination. What the examination produced, at this distance from the original incidents, was a more complete portrait than the coverage had provided, a portrait that contained the incidents and the name and the management alongside the intelligence and the genuine historical engagement and the writing and the 40 years of sustained presence in an institution that had never fully wanted her presence. She had been sustained anyway. She had sustained herself, which is a different thing, and a harder one. The institution had not sustained her. The institution had managed her, had found the available mechanisms for managing her, and had applied them with the consistency that the institution brings to the management of its problems. The management had not resolved the incompatibility. The incompatibility had run for 40 years and had not resolved. She had sustained herself through the incompatibility with the specific qualities that the incompatibility had, over 40 years, demonstrated were genuinely hers. The energy, the intelligence, the refusal to be reduced to what the institution preferred to reduce her to, the ongoing production of herself, in the full version the institution found excessive. She was still producing it. She was 75 years old in 2020, and she was still producing the full version of Princess Michael of Kent, in the space the institution had never been large enough to contain it in, and she was not going to stop producing it until the production was no longer possible. The production was still possible. The space was still too small. The continuing continued. Prince Philip died on the 9th of April, 2021, at Windsor Castle, at the age of 99. He had been in hospital for 4 weeks before his death. A cardiac procedure, the body's accumulated accounting presenting itself in the specific form that the bodies of very old men present their accountings, which is the form of the thing that can no longer be deferred. He had come back from the hospital, and he had been at Windsor for 4 weeks, and then he was gone. The coverage was enormous and reverential in the way that coverage of royal deaths is enormous and reverential when the person who has died has been present in the public life for long enough that their absence is felt as the absence of something permanent that has become permanent absence. He had been present in the public life since 1947. He had been the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's consort, the figure at the edge of the official portraits, the man who was always there and always secondary in the constitutional sense, and always, in the living sense, formidably himself. He was 99 years old. He had served longer as consort than any previous consort in British history. He was gone. The funeral was on the 17th of April, 2021, at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The pandemic restrictions of the time permitted 30 mourners inside the chapel. 30 people, for a funeral that in other circumstances would have produced the full ceremonial weight of a state occasion, with hundreds of attendees. 30 people in the chapel, and the world watching outside. Princess Michael was among the 30. She was there in the black that the occasion required, in the composed and formal manner that the occasion required, in the position that her relationship to the institution and to the man being buried assigned her, not at the center of the occasion, not in the primary positions assigned to the primary mourners, but present, in the chapel, among the 30 who were permitted to be there. She had known Prince Philip for 43 years. She had known him from before the marriage. The world she had moved through in London in the 1970s was a world that overlapped with the extended circle of the royal family, and she had encountered him in that overlap before she became formally part of the institution. She had known him as a member of the family she had married into, as the consort of the sovereign, as the figure who occupied the specific and difficult position of the man who was always present and always secondary, and who had managed that position for longer than anyone else in comparable circumstances had managed it. His management of the position had been her point of reference, not in the obvious sense. She had not modeled herself on Philip, had not attempted to replicate his specific method of inhabiting a role that was not designed for someone of his qualities. She had been incapable of that specific replication, which was the primary content of 40 years of management. But she had understood, from watching him across 4 decades, something about what it looked like to bring a significant individual character to a role that did not have room for it, and to sustain the character within the role's constraints for decades. He had sustained his character within the constraints. She had not entirely sustained hers within the constraints. The difference between the two outcomes was not, in her understanding of it, entirely a difference of character. She was not less strong than Philip, not less determined, not less in possession of the qualities that sustaining oneself inside a difficult institutional position requires. The difference was the specific form the constraint took in her case, as opposed to his. Philip had entered the institution as the husband of the heir to the throne, and had understood, from the beginning, that the institution's requirements were what they were, and that meeting them was the primary professional project of his life. He had not liked all of the requirements. He had expressed his dislike through the specific mechanism of the gaffe, the public comment, that exceeded the institutional preference, that said more than the institutional preference endorsed, that demonstrated the presence of a character that the institutional preference was not entirely successful in containing. The gaffes were Philip's method of remaining himself within the constraint. They were recognized as his method. They were managed as his method, which meant that the management of them was built into the institutional expectation of him in a way that allowed the gaffes to be absorbed without becoming the primary definition of what he was. His primary definition remained the consort. Princess Michael's primary definition had become the incidents. The difference was not entirely the quantity or the severity of the things that had exceeded the institutional preference. Philip's record of things that had exceeded the preference was not obviously shorter or less serious than hers. The difference was the position. He was the consort of the sovereign. The management of what exceeded the preference for someone in that position was organized around the primary importance of the position and the primary importance of the person who held it. She was the wife of a minor member of the extended family. The management of what exceeded the preference for someone in her position was organized around the primary importance of managing the problem rather than the primary importance of the person. The distinction is not moral. It is structural. The institution manages by position first and by person second, which means that the same kind of excess receives different management depending on the position from which it is produced. Philip's excess was managed within the frame of an essential figure. Her excess was managed within the frame of a problem to be contained. She understood this. She had understood it for decades, had articulated it in the late interviews with the candor that the late interviews had always contained. She said, in one of them, that the institution had never quite seen her as a person, had seen her as a category, as a management challenge, as the wife of Prince Michael who kept generating incidents, rather than as a specific individual whose specific qualities were worth engaging with on their own terms. She had found this unjust. It was unjust in the way that structural things are unjust, not through the deliberate malice of any specific person, not through the operation of a calculated unfairness, but through the operation of a structure that was organized around its own imperatives and that processed the people within it accordingly. The funeral of Prince Philip was the occasion on which all of this was visible in a specific and concentrated form. She was there. She was in the chapel. She was among the 30 who were permitted to be present. She was present as what she had always been, a member of the extended royal family, the wife of the cousin of the Queen, someone who had been in the institution for 43 years and who was still there, still present, still occupying the space available to her. The space available to her at the funeral was the space the 30 permitted and the institution assigned, which was not a central space and was not meant to be. She occupied it with the composure that the occasion required and did not occupy it with more than the composure that the occasion required, which was itself a form of the management she had been working on since December 2017. Harry was at the funeral. He had flown back from California for it. He sat in the chapel among the 30, in a position that reflected the complicated state of his relationship with the institution in April 2021. Present, because the institution was his family, and his grandfather was being buried. Separate, because the departure and the interview and everything that had followed them had created a separateness that could not be entirely resolved by presence at a funeral. He and William walked side by side after the service, as this account described in the Tiggy section. The walking was observed and covered with the intensity of people who are watching for the thing that will tell them whether the family is repairing. Princess Michael walked in her own position. She walked with the composure of someone who has attended enough occasions like this one to understand that the occasions are for the person being mourned, and that the specific dramas of the people attending them are secondary to that. She mourned Prince Philip, not in the visible, performed way of public mourning that the cameras record and that the coverage uses as material, in the private way of someone who has known a person for 43 years and who understands, at the moment of the person's death, that the knowing is over. He had been there when she arrived in 1978. He had been there through every incident and every management difficulty and every cycle of coverage, and every cycle of the name, and everything else that 43 years had contained. He had not been warm to her. The accounts that exist of his relationship to Princess Markle suggest something that was not unkind, but that was not warm. The specific coolness of someone who understood what she was, and found it more manageable at a distance. The distance had been maintained across 43 years. He was gone now. The distance was now the permanent distance of death. She was at the funeral, and she was in the chapel, and she was present in the 30, and the world was watching, and she was simply, in the most available and most honest sense, there. There was where she had always been. There was where she remained. The occasion concluded. The service ended. The family dispersed in the various directions that the pandemic restrictions and the institutional requirements and the personal circumstances of each of them determined. Princess Markle went back to Kensington Palace. Prince Michael went back to Kensington Palace. The palace continued. The institution continued. The continuing continued. She was 76 years old. Philip was buried. The Queen was alone. The generation that had been there when Princess Markle arrived was almost entirely gone. She was still there. The Queen died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, at the age of 96. She had been in declining health for some months, visible in the photographs and the footage of the preceding year, the body doing what the bodies of very old people do when the accumulated weight of 9 decades has reached the point where the weight is more than the body can continue to carry. She had been at Balmoral for the summer, and she had stayed at Balmoral through August and into September, and the reports from Balmoral in the final days had the quality of reports that are being carefully managed to prepare for something without explicitly announcing it. Then it was announced. The announcement came in the early afternoon of the 8th of September, and it was received in the way that announcements of this magnitude are received when they have been simultaneously expected and denied, in the specific psychological way that people deny things they know are coming, because the knowing is too large to hold in its full form until the moment the holding is required. The holding was required. The world held it. Princess Markle was 77 years old when the Queen died. She had been in the institution since 1978. She had arrived in the institution during the reign that had just ended, which meant that the entire span of her connection to the royal family, the 44 years, the Kensington Palace flat, the books, the incidents, the name, the management, the brooch, the pandemic, Prince Philip's funeral, had happened during the specific reign that was now over. She had never been in the institution under any other monarch. This is a fact that sounds like a minor biographical detail, and is, on examination, something more substantial. The Queen had been the sovereign during every year of Princess Markle's marriage to Prince Michael, and every year of her occupation of the position of Princess Markle of Kent, and every year of the accumulated history this account has described. The institution that Princess Markle had been incompatible with for 44 years had been organized, at its constitutional center, around Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II was gone. The institution continued. The institution always continues. This is its primary quality, the continuity that transcends the individuals within it, that persists through the changes of reign and the changes of membership and the changes of the world around it. Charles III was king. The institution was the institution. But the specific institution that Princess Markle had been navigating for 44 years, the institution with the specific queen at its center, who had been there when Princess Markle arrived, and who had been the sovereign through everything that had followed, that specific version of the institution was over. The funeral was the 19th of September 2022. It was the largest state occasion Britain had organized in decades, the lying-in state, the queues of hundreds of thousands of people who came to pay their respects, the global broadcast, the heads of state, and the representatives of the nations of the Commonwealth and the European monarchies, the full institutional weight of an occasion that was both the mourning of a specific person and the performance of the monarchy's continuity across the change of reign. Princess Markle attended. She was in Westminster Abbey for the service, in the position that her rank and her relationship to the new king assigned her, not at the center of the occasion, not in the seats reserved for the principal mourners, but present, as she had been present at 44 years of occasions, in the space the institution assigned. She was composed. She was dressed in the black that the occasion required. She was there. The occasion was, in the specific way of occasions this large, the occasion of many things simultaneously: the mourning of the Queen, the accession of King Charles III, the performance of institutional continuity in the face of the most significant change the monarchy had undergone in 70 years. Princess Markle, in the middle of all of this, was simply a woman at the funeral of the Queen. The Queen she had known for 44 years. The Queen who had been the sovereign when she arrived in the institution and who had been the sovereign for every year that followed. The Queen whose acceptance of the marriage in 1978 had been the institutional acceptance that made the marriage possible, and whose acceptance had never quite extended to the specific enthusiastic embrace of Princess Markle as a member of the family that Princess Markle had perhaps hoped the acceptance would eventually produce. The embrace had not been produced. The acceptance had been real and had been maintained through 44 years of incidents and management and the name and everything else that 44 years had contained. The Queen had accepted Princess Markle into the institution in 1978 and had continued to accept her presence within it through every year that followed, which is its own specific form of the relationship between a sovereign and a member of the family she is responsible for. It was not warmth. It was not the specific warmth that the Queen extended to the people within the family to whom she was genuinely warm, but it was acceptance, and acceptance, in the specific institutional sense, of someone being permitted to remain within the institution across 44 years of the kind of history Princess Markle's 44 years contained, is not nothing. She had been permitted to remain. She remained. The funeral concluded. The family processed out of Westminster Abbey and dispersed in the various directions that families disperse after funerals, back to the residences, back to the private spaces, back to the ordinary life that has continued underneath the exceptional occasion and that reasserts itself when the occasion is over. Princess Markle went back to Kensington Palace. The palace was still there. She was still in it. The difference was that she was in it now under a different sovereign, under Charles III, who was the king, whose relationship to Princess Markle was the relationship of a cousin who had known her for 44 years and who had his own complex and specific understanding of what 44 years of that proximity had contained. The relationship between Charles III and Princess Markle is not in the public record with the specificity that would allow a precise description of its character. What is in the record is that they had known each other since before the marriage. They were contemporaries in the specific social world of the extended royal family, had been present at many of the same occasions across 4 decades, and that the knowledge of each other had the texture that long acquaintance gives to people who are related by the institution rather than by the kind of proximity that produces genuine friendship or genuine enmity. They were connected. The connection had never required either of them to be more specific about what it was than the institution required them to be. The institution required the acknowledgement of the connection and the performance of the appropriate courtesy between them and nothing beyond that. The performance continued under the new reign. The new reign was the reign of someone who had been shaped by the decades that had preceded it, who had been present through the 1978 marriage and the decades of incidents and management and the brooch and everything else the 44 years had contained, and who arrived at the throne with a specific understanding of the institution and its members that the specific history of those decades had produced. He was king now. Princess Markle was still Princess Markle of Kent. The title was hers because Prince Michael was still alive and she was still married to him, and the institution that had given her the title in 1978 was still the institution and still recognized the title and still permitted her to use it. And she used it. She had always used it with the specific appreciation of someone for whom the title carried the weight that her formation had taught her titles carried, not as an empty honorific, not as a social convenience, but as the specific acknowledgement of a position that was real and that she occupied with the full force of the character she had always brought to the occupation of it. The character had not diminished at 77. It was slightly more calibrated than it had been at 33, in the way that characters become calibrated when they have been in sustained contact with the resistance of a specific environment for 4 decades. The resistance had not reshaped the character. She was not a different person from the person who had arrived in Vienna in June 1978, with the Austrian baroness's self-understanding and the 6-foot height and the absolute conviction of her own significance. She was the same person, calibrated. The calibration was its own form of development. She had developed, not in the direction the institution had wanted her to develop, which was the direction of greater subordination of the individual to the institutional requirement, in the direction that 44 years of sustained contact with a specific reality produces in people who do not surrender to the reality, but who continue to engage with it across the decades of the engagement, toward a clearer, more specific, more honestly examined understanding of what the reality was and what her relationship to it had been. She understood her relationship to the institution more clearly at 77 than she had at 33. The understanding did not resolve the incompatibility. The incompatibility was structural. Structural incompatibilities do not resolve. They are understood more clearly over time, and the understanding is its own form of development, and the development continues until the person who is developing is no longer available to continue it. Princess Michael was still available. She continued. The institution continued. Both of them continued. The new reign began. There is a version of Princess Michael of Kent's story that the institution would prefer. In this version, she arrived in 1978 as a complication. A foreign-born woman with a complicated family history and a personality too large for the space available. And she was managed across the following decades with the patience that the institution brings to its management problems. And the management produced a gradual accommodation, and the accommodation was sufficient, and the matter was handled. The incidents are footnotes. The name is an unfortunate but not entirely inaccurate shorthand. The story is the story of the institution managing a difficult member and managing it adequately. This version is not wrong. It is also not the whole story. The whole story is the one this account has been assembling across 12 parts. The story of a woman who arrived in an institution with a specific formation and a specific character, and who encountered an institution whose requirements were not her formation's requirements, and who navigated the gap between them for 44 years without the gap closing and without herself being closed by the gap. The gap is the most honest thing about the story, not the incidents, which are the parts the coverage has always found most useful, not the name, which is the part that has attached to her most permanently in the public understanding, not the management, which is the part the institution has always preferred to emphasize. The gap, the structural incompatibility between a specific person and a specific institution, is the honest center of what the story actually is. Why does the gap matter beyond the specific case of Princess Michael of Kent? It matters because it is not unique to her. The gap between the individual and the institution's requirements is not a gap that only Princess Michael encountered. It is the gap that every person who enters the royal family from outside, who is not formed inside it, who has not absorbed its requirements as the background condition of what being themselves means, encounters in some form. Diana encountered it. The incompatibility between who Diana was and what the institution required of her is the most documented incompatibility in the history of the modern monarchy. The documentation is extensive because the incompatibility was extreme and its consequences were catastrophic. Meghan encountered it. The specific form her incompatibility took, the racially inflected coverage, the institutional inadequacy of the support available, the departure, is the most recent and most publicly examined version of the phenomenon. Princess Michael encountered it. Her version was less catastrophic than Diana's and less publicly dramatic than Meghan's, but it was the same phenomenon. The specific gap between a person who comes from outside the institution with their own formation and the institution's requirement that the formation be subordinated to its needs. The three versions of the phenomenon are different in their specifics and continuous in their structure. The structure is: institution admits person from outside. Person has own formation. Formation is incompatible with institutional requirement. Institution manages the incompatibility. The management is the content of the person's public life in the institution. The management never resolves the incompatibility because the incompatibility is structural, and structural incompatibilities do not resolve. They continue until the person leaves the institution or the person dies, or the institution changes. Diana left in the specific form of dying. Meghan left in the specific form of departing. Princess Michael has not left. She is still in the institution. She is still occupying the space the institution has always found too small for her. She is still filling it with the fullness of character that filling it fully has always required. The institution has not changed in any structural sense that would close the gap. The gap continues. What the 44 years of the gap have produced, in Princess Michael's specific case, is a body of evidence about the institution that the institution has not been required to engage with, but that the evidence itself makes available. The evidence is the incidents. Not in the tabloid sense, not in the sense that the incidents are interesting as individual stories, though some of them are. In the evidential sense, in the sense that the pattern of what happens when a person of Princess Michael's specific character occupies a space in the royal family tells you something about the space, about what the space requires and what it cannot accommodate, and what it does when the accommodation fails. What the space requires is the subordination of the individual to the collective image. What it cannot accommodate is the individual who will not be subordinated. What it does when the accommodation fails is manage, through the institutional channels, through the informal communications of preferences, through the name and the coverage and the public portrait that the management enables and that serves the institutional purpose of communicating to everyone else in similar proximity what the cost of refusing subordination is. Princess Michael was the communication. She was the ongoing, 44-year illustration of what the cost looked like, of what happened to someone who was more than the institution wanted, and who remained more than the institution wanted, through decades of the management designed to reduce the more to something the institution could contain. The management did not reduce her, she remained more. This is the thing that the established portrait, Princess Pushy, the in-law the palace couldn't control, gets closest to, without quite saying directly. The established portrait says she was too much. What it does not say, because saying it would require the coverage to evaluate rather than simply to document, is that being too much and remaining too much for 44 years in the face of everything the institution applied to the management of the too much is itself a form of something. Not a virtue exactly. She was not virtuous in the management of the gap. She was imprecise and sometimes careless, and the incidents were not always other people's fault, but something. The specific quality of someone who remains themselves across 44 years of sustained pressure to be something else, who arrives at the other side of those 44 years, still recognizably the person who entered the institution in June 1978, who has been shaped by the experience without being reshaped into a different person. She arrived in the institution as herself. She remained herself. The institution found this unacceptable for 44 years and managed it accordingly for 44 years. And at the end of the 44 years, she was still herself, and the institution was still the institution, and neither of them had resolved the incompatibility. The incompatibility will not be resolved. She is 78 years old. Prince Michael is 81. They are still in Kensington Palace. The palace is still the palace, still the building that contains the apartments of the senior members of the working royal family and the apartments of the extended family, and the specific social architecture of proximity among people who are connected by blood or marriage rather than by choice. She is still in it. The institution continues to be what it has always been, the embodiment of continuity, the performance of permanence, the symbolic anchoring of the national identity in something that persists through the changes around it. It is managed now by a king rather than a queen, by a generation younger than the generation that was there when Princess Michael arrived, in a world considerably different from the world of 1978. It is still organized around the requirement it has always organized itself around, the subordination of the individual to the collective image, the management of whatever exceeds the acceptable expression of individual character, the maintenance of the performance of coherence that the institution's function requires. She still exceeds the acceptable expression. The management continues. The question this account has been building toward, across 12 parts, and the considerable accumulation of incidents, and management, and coverage, and the name, and the brooch, and the pandemic, and the funerals, and the decades. The question is what the 44 years mean. Not for the institution, which processes them and continues. Not for the coverage, which has found in them reliable material and will continue to find reliable material in whatever remains, but for the understanding of what the royal family actually is and what it actually requires from the people who enter it from outside. What it requires is the self. Not the presence of the self, it requires presence. It requires people who show up and perform the role. What it requires is the surrender of the self, the subordination of the individual formation to the institutional requirement, the replacement of who you came from with who the institution needs, the performance of the role at the expense of the person. The people who manage this most completely are the people who are most completely invisible as individuals, who are seen through the role rather than alongside it, whose character is expressed only in the forms the role permits, and who have absorbed the role's permissions so thoroughly that no other forms are apparent. These people are the institution's ideal members. Princess Michael was never the institution's ideal member. She was, always, something else, something prior to the role, something that the role could not contain, something that kept exceeding the containing across 44 years, in ways that the institution managed, without resolving, and that the coverage documented, without understanding. What it was a person. Specific, particular, irreducible, Austrian and English and Mozambican and aristocratic and scholarly and social and ambitious and careless and warm in private and excessive in public, and more than the space available for more of her in any setting that the institution organized. A person. In an institution that requires the person to be less than they are. She was not less, she remained more. This is what the 44 years mean. Not triumph. She did not triumph over the institution. The institution continues, and the management was effective in managing what could be managed, and she paid the cost of the incidents in the currency of reputation that such incidents extract, and the cost was real, and was hers. Not defeat. She was not defeated by the institution. She is still there, still herself, still filling the space that was never large enough for her with the fullness of character that the filling requires. Something in between, and more honest than either triumph or defeat allows. The sustained, ongoing, 44-year demonstration of what it looks like when a specific person declines. Not through heroism, and not through defiance, but simply through the ordinary persistence of being who they are. To be entirely managed by an institution that has been managing people for centuries and that has never quite managed to manage her. She is still there. The institution is still there. The gap between them is still there. The gap is the story. The story continues. The marriage lasted. This is the fact about Princess Michael of Kent that the coverage of the preceding decades has consistently underweighted in its focus on the incidents and the management and the name, the simple, irrefutable fact that the marriage she entered in Vienna in June 1978 was still the marriage she was in 44 years later, and that the 44 years had contained everything this account has described and had not broken it. Marriages that last 44 years in the context of what the Kensington Palace years contained are not accidents. They are the product of something, of a connection between two people that is more substantial than the difficulties that accumulate around it, more durable than the pressures the institution and the press and the financial complications and the incidents can bring to bear on it, more real than the portrait the coverage constructed of a woman whose primary relationship was with her own ambition rather than with the man she had married. The portrait was wrong about this. Not wrong in the way of a portrait that is constructed from false material. The material was real, the incidents were real, the ambition was real. Wrong in the way of a portrait that uses real material to construct an emphasis that the material does not entirely support. Princess Michael was ambitious. She was also, and this is the part of the portrait that the emphasis on the ambition consistently obscured, genuinely devoted to Prince Michael, in the specific way that long marriages are genuine when they are genuine, not as performance, not as the strategic maintenance of a useful arrangement, but as the actual primary relationship of her adult life. Prince Michael George Charles Franklin is, in the coverage of Princess Michael of Kent, consistently a background figure. He appears in the incidents as the person whose position generated the incidents. He appears in the financial difficulties as the person whose commercial arrangements generated the difficulties. He appears at the official occasions as the person beside whom Princess Michael is standing when the photographs are taken. He is rarely the subject of the photographs. This is consistent with how the institution manages the minor royals. They are present at occasions and are present in the coverage of the occasions without being the primary object of either the occasions or the coverage. Prince Michael is a minor royal whose title is real and whose constitutional significance is minimal, and whose public profile is what the public profile of someone in his specific position tends to be, which is modest. He is also, and the people who have known him well across the decades consistently report this, a man of genuine quality, gentle, intelligent, genuinely interested in the world and in the people in it, warm in the private sense that the institution does not always produce in the people it contains. He speaks Russian, has a serious engagement with Russian culture and history that predates and is independent of the Putin arrangement, and that is the product of genuine intellectual curiosity rather than commercial calculation. He looks like the Tsar. This is an observation people make about him with the frequency that observations are made about resemblances that are genuinely striking. The physical similarity between Prince Michael of Kent and Tsar Nicholas II is remarkable enough that it has been documented repeatedly across the decades. In the photography books and the historical accounts and the coverage that finds the resemblance interesting for the specific reasons that physical resemblances between living people and the dead become interesting when the dead are the dead they are in this case. It is also, and this is the detail that Princess Michael has spoken about in the interviews with a warmth that the interviews of other subjects in this account have rarely produced. One of the things she found immediately compelling about him when they met. She is a woman of historical imagination. She is a woman who has spent her professional life engaging with the specific texture of European courts and European aristocratic history, with the people who moved through those courts and what they looked like and how they presented themselves. She met a man who looked like the last Tsar of Russia, and she found this remarkable in the way that she found most things remarkable. Completely, immediately, with the full engagement of someone for whom the world is always providing material worth noticing. She noticed him, he noticed her. What developed between them was not, by the accounts available, a slow-burning recognition of compatible qualities. It was faster than that, the specific speed of a connection between two people who understand very quickly that the other person is genuinely interesting, and who find in that understanding the beginning of something. They had both been married before. Both had been in relationships that had not worked. Both arrived at the meeting with the specific understanding that comes from having learned what a relationship that does not work feels like from the inside, and the understanding had given each of them a clearer sense of what they were looking for than people who have not had this specific education tend to have. What they were looking for was each other, not in the vague sense of people who discover retrospectively that they were looking for the specific person they found, in the more specific sense of people who understand, when they find the thing, that the thing is what they had been looking for, that the qualities present in this person are the qualities they had been unable to find in previous arrangements, and that the finding of them produces the specific relief of something settled. The relief was mutual. He was relieved to have found someone who was fully present in any room, who did not require the social occasion to come to her, but who went to it, who filled it, who made the occasion more than it had been before she arrived. He was a reserved man, genuinely reserved rather than performatively modest, and the reserve had always been accompanied by the understanding that reserve on its own was not the complete version of what a shared life required. She was the complete version of what the reserve was incomplete without. She was relieved to have found someone who was interested in her rather than in the performance of her, who was sufficiently secure in himself to not find her fullness threatening, who did not require her to be smaller than she was in order to accommodate him. He never required her to be smaller. This is the thing about Prince Michael of Kent that the coverage of Princess Michael consistently fails to account for. He knew who she was when he married her. He had known her for long enough before the marriage to understand that the qualities that made her remarkable were the same qualities that made her excessive, and that the excessive and the remarkable were the same quality expressed in different contexts. He chose this. He was not surprised by what the marriage became, because what the marriage became was the expression of the qualities he had chosen when he chose her. He never asked her to be different. The institution asked her to be different, consistently and across 4 decades. The press asked her to be different, through the name and the coverage and the portrait. The people adjacent to the institution, the courtiers, the officials, the managed world of palace proximity, communicated, through the channels such communications travel, that different would be preferred. He never joined the communication. He was beside her at the incidents. He was there at the press conference about the SS facts in 1985, in the specific position of someone who is present, because the person beside him needs presence, rather than because the incident requires his commentary. He was there at the subsequent incidents, in the subsequent positions, not managing her, not performing the management that the people around them expected the husband of a difficult wife to perform, but simply there. The simply there, across 44 years, is the thing. He was simply there. She was simply herself. The combination of those two things, his capacity to be simply there for the full version of who she was, her capacity to be the full version of who she was, alongside someone who had decided that the full version was the version he wanted, was the foundation of the marriage. The foundation held. It held through the financial difficulties and the incidents and the management, and the name, and the SS revelation, and the plagiarism controversy, and the Putin arrangement, and the brooch, and the pandemic, and the illnesses, and the funerals of the people who had been there when they arrived. It held because foundations hold when they are real. The coverage of Princess Michael has always struggled to account for the holding, because the holding complicates the portrait. A woman whose primary relationship is with her own ambition, whose primary project is the advancement of her own position, does not stay married to the same man for 44 years in the specific way that Princess Michael has stayed married to Prince Michael. Not contractually, not for the institutional convenience of maintaining the title, but with the genuine and visible quality of someone who is, at 77, still married in the active and engaged sense of the word, rather than the residual sense. She is still married to him. He is still married to her. The 44 years are in both of them, in the specific way that decades of shared experience accumulate in the people who share them, as the background condition of the self, as the context in which everything is experienced, as the place you return to when the occasions and the incidents and the management have been navigated, and the returning is simply the returning. She returns to Prince Michael. He is there. The marriage, which is the least discussed and most significant fact about Princess Michael of Kent, continues. In the specific context of the institution that has spent 44 years managing the incompatibility between Princess Michael and its requirements, the marriage is the thing the management did not manage, and the coverage did not cover, and the portrait did not include, and that has nevertheless been present across all 44 years as the primary fact about her private life. She is loved by someone who chose her fully, knowing what the full version was, and has continued to choose her across 44 years of the full version being consistently expressed. This is not nothing. It is, in the accounting of a life, among the most significant things available. What does Princess Michael of Kent leave behind? Not in the institutional sense, not the question of what title or position or official role she leaves, because the answer to that question is the answer to questions about minor royal succession and is of limited general interest. In the more significant sense, what does the story of her 44 years in the institution leave in the record, and what does the record reveal that would not be revealed without it? The first thing it leaves is the clearest available illustration of what the institution's requirement of subordination actually costs. This might seem like an odd legacy for someone who never successfully met the requirement, who was unable or unwilling to provide the subordination the institution asked for, and who paid the cost of the failure in the specific currency of reputation that the coverage administered across 4 decades. But the failure to meet the requirement is precisely what makes the illustration clear. The people who meet the requirement are invisible as illustrations of it. They meet it so completely that the meeting itself is not visible. It is simply the background condition of their existence in the institution. the unremarkable fact of their being who the institution needs. You cannot see the requirement in the people who meet it, because the meeting makes them the institution rather than people. You can see the requirement in Princess Michael because she didn't meet it, and the not meeting made the requirement visible in the specific way that the violation of a rule makes the rule visible, by showing you what happens when it is not followed. What happens is the management. What the management produces is the portrait. What the portrait communicates to every other person who is in or adjacent to the institution and who understands what the portrait is for, is the cost of the not meeting. The cost is high. The cost is 44 years of the name and the incidents and the specific social and professional diminishment of someone whose qualities, in a different context, would have been recognized as assets rather than managed as problems. This is the first thing the story leaves, a clear accounting of what the requirement costs. The second thing it leaves is the documentation of the incompatibility between individual formation and institutional requirement that the three most significant cases of the modern era, Diana, Princess Michael, Meghan, all illustrate in different forms. The documentation is significant because it is cumulative. Each case adds to the evidence that the incompatibility is not accidental, not the result of individual character failures, not the product of specific women being specifically unsuited to the institutional world they entered. It is structural. The institution requires a specific kind of subordination, and the people who enter it from outside, with their own formations and their own understandings of their own significance, encounter that requirement, and the encounter produces the incompatibility. The incompatibility produces incidents. The incidents produce management. The management produces coverage. The coverage produces portraits. The portraits communicate the cost. The cost deters some people from the same kind of expression and does not deter others, and the institution manages whichever ones it needs to manage and continues. This has been the pattern across three significant cases. The documentation of the pattern, accumulated across the decades of the three cases, is the clearest account available of what the pattern is and what it does to the people inside it. Princess Michael's contribution to the documentation is, in some respects, the most sustained and the most consistent. She has been inside the pattern longer than Diana and longer, to date, than Meghan, and her presence within it has been continuous rather than concluded by departure or death. She is still there. The pattern is still running. The documentation is still accumulating. This is unusual. The more common outcome of the incompatibility is the resolution, the departure, in various forms, of the person whose incompatibility with the institutional requirement cannot be managed into something sustainable. Diana's departure was death. Meghan's departure was relocation. Princess Michael has not departed. She has remained inside the institution in a state of sustained incompatibility for 44 years and continues to remain in it. The sustained incompatibility and the staying inside it rather than departing is itself a form of evidence about what the incompatibility is and what it does and what the people inside it are capable of sustaining. She has sustained it. The sustaining is not heroic in the narrative sense. She did not choose the incompatibility as a form of resistance, did not remain inside it as a political statement about the institution's requirements, did not stay for any reason that can be described in the vocabulary of heroism. She stayed because Prince Michael was there, and the marriage was there, and the palace was there, and the title was there, and the life she had built inside those things was the life available. She inhabited the life available. She inhabited it fully, in the specific mode of fullness that had always been her mode, and the fullness had produced the incidents, and the management, and the name, and the coverage, and the portrait, and it had also produced the books, and the charitable work, and the 44 years of sustained presence in an institution that had never quite known what to do with her, and that had managed accordingly. The third thing the story leaves is the complication it provides to the easy narratives about the royal family. The easy narratives come in two forms, roughly corresponding to the two primary positions available in the public conversation about the monarchy. The first is the reverential narrative, the monarchy as institution of extraordinary historical significance and cultural continuity, whose management of the people within it is governed by the requirements of that significance and that continuity, and whose decisions about individual members are properly understood in the context of those requirements, rather than in the context of individual fairness to individual people. The second is the critical narrative, the monarchy as a system of inherited privilege that reproduces the worst qualities of class and race and gender hierarchy, and that damages the individuals within it for the maintenance of a symbolic function that does not justify the damage. Both narratives are available as frames for Princess Michael's story. The reverential narrative frames her as a management challenge correctly managed, someone whose individual qualities created institutional problems that the institution handled as institutions handle problems, without malice and in the service of the collective image that the institution exists to maintain. The critical narrative frames her as a victim of the institution's requirement of subordination, someone whose genuine qualities were rendered problematic by the specific form the institutional requirement took, and who paid for the rendering with 4 decades of reputation damage that exceeded anything her actual conduct warranted. What her story complicates about both narratives is the simplicity of each. The reverential narrative is complicated by the evidence that the management of Princess Michael was not simply the institution handling a problem for the collective good. It was the institution handling the problem in ways that served the institutional interest without accounting for the human cost to the person being managed. The accounting for the human cost is not a requirement the institution recognized as a requirement. It did not ask whether the management was proportionate or whether the portrait it enabled was accurate, or whether the 44 years of the name was a just consequence of what the name was attached to. It managed and continued. The critical narrative is complicated by the evidence that Princess Michael was not simply a victim of the institution's requirements. She contributed to her own situation in ways that the critical narrative's framing of her as victim does not fully accommodate. She was careless when care was available. She was excessive when restraint was available. She gave the management its material, with the consistency of someone who was not always thinking about the consequences of what she was giving it. The story is more complicated than either narrative contains. This is the third thing it leaves, the complication. The evidence that the easy frames are insufficient. The documentation of a specific case in sufficient detail that the specificity resists the simplifications the frames require. The simplifications do not hold against the specificity. The specificity is 44 years of a specific person in a specific institution, documented in the specific coverage of the specific incidents, with the specific complicating facts of the genuine intelligence, and the genuine marriage, and the genuine charitable work, and the genuine historical engagement, alongside the specific complicating facts of the specific incidents, and the specific management, and the specific cost. All of it is there. The coverage has always been there. The coverage is its own form of documentation, imperfect, organized around its own interests and its own forms of simplification, but abundant. 4 decades of abundant coverage of Princess Michael of Kent is, in the aggregate, more primary material than most historical cases of this kind produce. The material is available for whoever wants to engage with it seriously. The institution has not engaged with it seriously. The institution does not engage seriously with the coverage of its own management of its own members, because the engagement would require the examination of the management in ways that the institution has not found it necessary to perform. It has not found it necessary because it has not been required to find it necessary. The story of Princess Michael has not required the institution to examine itself. It has been managed, through the portrait, through the name, through the communication of the cost of incompatibility to the people in and around the institution, in ways that served the institutional interest without requiring self-examination. The self-examination is what this account has tried to provide on the institution's behalf. The examination produces the conclusion that the institution has managed a specific person across 44 years in ways that served the institutional interest at the person's expense, without accounting for the expense, without acknowledging the expense, without being required to justify the expense. The expense was real. It was paid by Princess Michael of Kent in the currency of reputation and in the currency of the specific social diminishment of someone whose qualities, in the accounting of a world that was not organized around the institutional requirement she failed to meet, were genuine and significant. She paid it. She is still paying it, in the specific form of the portrait that continues to be the primary frame through which she is received, the portrait the institution enabled and the coverage maintained, and that remains the default understanding of who she is. The portrait is not the whole person. The whole person is more complicated than the portrait. She is more complicated than the portrait. She has always been more than the institution wanted. She will be more than the institution wanted until the end. This is what the 44 years leave. Not triumph, not defeat. The specific, sustained, complicated, imperfect, genuine record of a woman who was more than the space available for her, and who remained more across 44 years, in which the institution managed the more with everything it had, and did not reduce it to something it could fully contain. She remained more. She is still more. The institution continues. So does she.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.